There is a moment in ancient history where the story of humanity simply stops making sense. A single line, pressed into a clay tablet over 5,000 years ago, quietly claims that civilization began long before the world we know. It was ruled not by ordinary kings, but by beings who reigned for over 241,000 years, 8 rulers, nearly 250,000 years, and then a flood. No transition, no explanation, just an impossible world erased overnight, and a new one rising immediately from the mud. Archaeologists expected this to be myth, until they dug through the soil of ancient Mesopotamia and found something they were never prepared to see: a sterile layer of flood sediment, thick enough to smother cities, separating one age of humanity from another with the precision of a page being turned. Beneath it, strange temples, strange symbols, cultures with origins no one can trace. Above it, the sudden appearance of Sumer. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, irrigation, law, all fully formed as if memory itself had survived the water. And the deeper you look, the stranger it becomes. The numbers in the King List map astronomical cycles no early culture should have understood. The oldest star charts in the world track movements that require thousands of years of observation. And the myths aren't about invention, they're about recovery, knowledge descending from heaven, not rising from trial and error. Civilizers emerging from the water, carrying bags of tools and star wisdom. Cities rebuilt on top of cities, as if restoring a pattern older than the flood itself. The question isn't whether the Sumerians believed this. The question is why their memories keep matching the ground beneath our feet. Because if civilization really did restart after a cataclysm, if the King List is not the beginning of history, but a message from the world before it, then the oldest story humanity ever wrote isn't about kings at all. It's about amnesia, and what survived the last time the world ended. The clay prism at the centre of this story looks small enough to fit in your hand, but the numbers written on it do not fit anywhere. It lists 8 rulers whose combined reigns equal 241,200 years, an arithmetic that leaves no space for human lifespans, dynastic turnover, or the fragile math of memory. Each line gives a name, a city, and a reign measured not in years but in an era's patience. You read it once and assume it is myth. You read it twice and notice the rhythm of ledger habits. This is not poetry, it is accounting, cut into wet clay and set to harden. And the place of its discovery matters. It comes from the ruins of Nippur, a city that functioned for millennia as a spiritual and administrative hub, a place where texts were copied because institutions needed continuity. A myth can be sung anywhere. A list like this belongs in an archive. The form turns the knife. The prism is 4-sided, carefully inscribed with cuneiform. The writing is steady. The structure is methodical. Each entry follows a pattern. A city receives kingship. A ruler reigns. The count is logged. Then kingship moves. There is no warning label that says, "Now entering mythic time." The tablet does not separate memory from legend. It stacks them into one file and stores it in the same format used for rations, land, and taxes. The shock does not come from the scale of the lifespans. It comes from the confidence of the document. This is how Sumer treated the beginning of political order, as data. Those early reigns are measured in tens of thousands of years. Not one outlier or two, but a system of numbers that seems to respect its own internal logic. You can stare at the figure 241,200 and feel your sense of chronology wobble. It does not fit into any school timeline. It does not fit into evolutionary charts or demography. Yet the scribes who carved it were the same kind who tallied grain in exact quantities and recorded temple inventories with a precision that still embarrasses modern guesswork. That is the crux. They knew how to count. They chose these counts on purpose. Set aside for a moment any desire to decode the numbers into biology. Think instead about what kind of society frames origin stories in the language of administration. When this list says a king reigned for 28,800 years, it binds a mythic claim to an office. It removes the soft edges that let myths wander. It pins them down to cities you can point to on a map. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. It treats a pre-flood world like a sequence of jurisdictions, each with a tenure, then a transfer of authority. That choice tells you more about Sumer than any romantic tale about gods and heroes. It shows a culture that thought institutions were older than memory and that time itself could be managed by titles. The location of discovery, Nippur, adds another layer. Nippur mattered to later Babylonians and Assyrians, and texts from there often served to anchor political claims. Finding this prism in such a place says the list was not fringe. It sat inside the mainstream of the scribal world, where records shaped how power justified itself. When later rulers wanted to tie themselves to antiquity, they did it through lists, chronicles, and lineages. The king list fits that function, but it also does something else. It refuses to mark a divide between impossible reigns and verifiable ones. One line bends time into a number no human can live. The next line might carry the name of a king. Archaeologists can corroborate. There is no switch that flips from myth to history. It is all one braid. Pause on the craft of the object. A four-sided prism is not casual. It can be turned and read like a device for storage and recitation. Each side carries columns that march with a sense of order you associate with administrative documents, not with poems that shift and breathe. That matters because we often treat ancient myth as flexible. This text treats its content as fixed. The act of impressing wet clay with a stylus locks the account into place. Once fired, it resists alteration. You're looking at a community that wanted this to last, and that treated numbers as the framework strong enough to carry a story across generations. There is also the matter of scale within the list. The earliest span totals 241,200 years. That figure as a whole feels like a headline, but the list does not boast. It proceeds with the same flat tone used to note a delivery of barley. That tone is part of the problem. You expect an extravagant claim to announce itself. Instead, the outrageous lives in the ordinary. A measured voice reports an unmeasurable time. That is the unsettling part. It is not madness, it is method. Now consider the way the list binds kingship to cities. Authority does not live in a person. It lives in a place and moves when history moves. The list tracks this movement as if kingship were a charter that could be transferred between capitals. That habit of thought gives the numbers a home in a real landscape. You can walk the ruins of those cities today, read layers of earth, and confront the fact that the names align with actual places. The numbers do not float on their own. They sit in a network of locations, which lends the whole account a kind of grounded audacity. It dares you to dismiss the times while taking away your ability to dismiss the sites. Scholars focus on this prism because it concentrates a world view. The Sumerians wrote myths elsewhere. They wrote hymns and epics and ritual instructions. Here, they wrote a timeline. And in that timeline, they merged beings who belonged to deep time with kings who left graves and statuary and legal acts. No ancient record so calmly merges the impossible and the documented. That is the line this list crosses. It does not debate belief, it encodes it. The physical details of the piece reinforce its authority. Clay is cheap but durable. Cuneiform is slow but exact. Each wedge is a decision. Each line is a claim. In a world with few distractions, the act of copying such a list was an act of judgment. Scribes selected what deserved to endure. They copied because institutions demanded continuity. The survival of this prism is not an accident. It reflects a chain of people who saw value in preserving these reigns in this form. The city of Nippur, where it was found, functioned as a kind of clearinghouse for texts. That setting allowed documents to accumulate, be recopied, and travel to other archives. A list like this, sitting alongside legal codes and hymns, places the earliest kings inside the same informational economy as tax records. In that context, the use of gigantic reign lengths looks less like melodrama and more like a code. The numbers work as a language that a trained reader can read on multiple levels. A literal level for those who want a continuous political story, and a symbolic level for those who approach time with larger units than a human generation. The number 241,200 sits like a keystone. It invites breakdown into components. Sumerian math used base 60, and multiples of 60 have a way of structuring time, from minutes to degrees. This is not the place to leap into an astronomical treatise, but the presence of orderly, round figures creates the sense that these entries reference systems of time bigger than a lifetime. The people who wrote this list designed calendars and tracked cycles. They did not throw numbers carelessly. Even if you do not accept any hidden code, the discipline of the figures resists the idea of accident. Another aspect complicates the reading. The list does not hide the flood. It places a boundary in the flow of rains and then continues counting. A reset appears, but the voice stays the same. That rhetorical consistency removes drama and builds credibility in the way a steady narrator does. The story absorbs a cataclysm without changing tone. For modern readers, that creates cognitive dissonance. We expect myths to glow and histories to cool. The King List refuses that split. It runs everything through the same temperature. This refusal spreads into how we think about the origins of civilization. If a culture of accountants and temple administrators chose to freeze its origins into a dataset where some lines can be matched in the ground and others cannot, the result is not confusion. It is a world view. Time for them was a field where divine order and civic order overlapped. The list keeps that overlap intact. To tear it apart for convenience would be to misread the purpose of the object. The prism's survival allows us to face an uncomfortable possibility. When you see names that later archaeology can verify sitting 3 paragraphs away from reign lengths that exceed geologic patience, you confront a culture that did not draw our lines. This section of the story is where the problem crystallizes. 8 kings, 241,200 years. No apology. Then a flood. Then rulers we can track by bricks and bones. The tablet presents a continuity that our models do not allow. That mismatch is the engine that drives the debate, and it is why this object commands so much attention. It asks whether the earliest history was recorded as memory, metaphor, or both, and whether those categories even mattered to the people who carved the text. So the prism sits there, 4 sides of calm certitude. A small thing with large consequences, it does not explain itself, it does not argue, it records. And because it records with the same habits used for the daily work of a city, its claims carry the authority of procedure. That is the trap and the gift. You can reject the durations as impossible and still accept the document as vital. Or you can admit that the document does not care what you think about possible. It cares about preserving a line of kings that should not exist, stated with a confidence that makes dismissal feel premature and invites a harder look at the ground those numbers stand on. Hold the prism in your mind the way a curator would. A 4-sided clay object, hand-sized, steady, and ordinary at first glance. It was found in 1922 at Lhasa and reached the Ashmolean Museum a year later. It's not a monument, it's not a temple relief, it's closer to a ledger, dense with wedge marks, lines arranged like a clerk had a deadline. Yet this quiet object states the timeline of the world with the confidence of an accountant balancing a column. Names, cities, reign lengths, no preface, no disclaimer, no warning labels. Each face carries a continuous flow of cuneiform, and the tone reads as administrative rather than poetic. You can hear the cadence of routine, ruler, city, years, again and again. That's the pattern that makes the content so unsettling. There is no pause when the text passes from reigns of impossible duration into eras that later archaeology can place. It doesn't flag a genre change. It doesn't announce myth and then history. The style remains flat, meticulous and methodical, as if reciting shipments of barley. The mundane voice is the trapdoor. What makes it more disorienting is the form factor. This is not a giant stele meant to dazzle a crowd. It's small, like a paperback you could turn in your hands. You can rotate it and read all 4 sides, each column aligning to the next with the tidy efficiency of an office tool. It feels like a portable summary, the kind of document a scholar official could keep as a reference. The idea that such a modest artifact carries a timeline extending into spans that defy biology and common sense forces a double take. The scale of the claim doesn't match the scale of the object. The content structure amplifies the effect. It doesn't argue, it lists. City by city, it moves across a map of Mesopotamia, assigning power to different centres across time. The sequence isn't painted with metaphors about cosmic dawns or heroic ages. It proceeds with placid certainty. When we recognise some of the later kings from other sources, the continuity becomes problematic. That is where the prism refuses to help you separate legend from record. The texture of the writing never changes. A century, a millennium, or a span that looks like a cycle, everything wears the same uniform. The lack of literary flourish matters. In many ancient texts, mythical material arrives with cues, divine epithets, ritual openings, or poetic meters. Here, the prose stays bureaucratic. That tone invites trust. In an archive, we grant authority to texts that sound like minutes from a meeting. The prism uses that voice to tell a story that should require ceremony, and then it doesn't. And because it doesn't, the reader's skepticism has to supply all the friction. The document itself will not slow down for you. Consider how the physicality of the prism shapes its purpose. A 4-sided clay prism is efficient for dense entries and long sequences. It can be held, rotated, and copied from easily. Scribes could replicate its format. Officials could consult it. It looks engineered for reference, not for performance in a temple courtyard. That suggests it participated in an environment where lists were tools, city lists, taxation lists, deity lists, king lists. In that context, the inclusion of reigns from an age that makes no biological sense is not an anomaly to the scribe. It is part of the template. Authority comes from continuity. The prism's inscription features a clean typology, a name, a location, a duration. The formula is tight. That tightness is important when you think about how people copy documents. Rigid formulas reduce errors. They also make it easier to preserve patterns that might be mnemonic, and if the numbers functioned as memory devices, whether for ritual cycles, civic sequences, or astronomical counts, the dryness of the format would help. The very thing that reads as tedious to a modern eye could be the mechanism that carried the content across centuries. Now focus on the tension between the smallness of the clay object and the sweep of the claims it contains. This is where many modern readers want a red flag. Where is the marginal note that says, "From here to here, treat as divine time. From here on, treat as mortal time"? It doesn't exist. The list refuses to make that editorial boundary visible. That refusal is part of the puzzle. If the scribal tradition behind the prisms or continuity where we see rupture, then the document preserves a worldview in which cosmic, ritual, and political time occupy the same track. The prism is the map of that single track. When museum catalogues describe it, they focus on its completeness and the systematic nature of its entries. Systematic is the important word. The structure forces a single, coherent order onto eras of different character. Think about what that means for readers in later ages. They inherit a series that claims to be complete. It's not a bundle of separate legends sorted later into an anthology. It's already a compilation unified by a single spine. That unity empowers later editors to extend it, amend it, and align their present to the distant past without ever admitting the splice. The prism's presence in a museum today encourages another mistake. We place it behind glass and expect something grand. Instead, it offers restraint. The lines are tight. The clay is practical. The effect is closer to a spreadsheet-baked solid. The cognitive dissonance is not just the lengths of time, it's the pairing of those lengths with the tone of a clerk. You can deny the numbers, you can reject the chronology. But you have to contend with the fact that the list presents them with a confidence that depends on record-keeping, not on spectacle. If you scan across the entries, you notice other quiet choices. The list assigns kings to cities, not empires. It organises sovereignty geographically, node by node, as if power passes like a baton from urban centre to urban centre. That structure calls attention to place as the carrier of legitimacy. Under that logic, the longevity of the reigns becomes part of how. The list asserts a deep past anchored in specific seats of power. Even the incredible durations serve a function. They fix memory to locations that mattered for ritual and identity. The list gives you the map first, then the time. That interplay between place and time is where many readers suspect code. If the durations act as keys, say, multiples useful for ritual calendars or cycles, then the list doubles as a tool for syncing civic life with a cosmic schedule. A compact clay object with stable geometry and thick surfaces would be ideal for preserving such keys. A list like that doesn't need metaphors, it needs accuracy in transcription. It needs no warning labels because to the users of the list the warnings would be obvious. They share the assumptions the list rests on. We don't. The date of its arrival in modern hands matters less than the conditions that allowed it to be created. Larsa, Ashmolean, museum case. Those are the late chapters. The origin story is scribes working in a culture where long chronologies supported authority. A tradition like that would normalise reconciling legendary reigns with recent memory. Standardisation is the tool. Copy the pattern, fill the columns, align the city names with known cult centres. If a reign spans beyond a human lifetime, that is not a problem to solve, it is a datum to preserve. It helps to consider how the prism would have been read aloud. In a school or court, a reciter would move line by line, each entry dictating how the audience should think about sequence. The audience doesn't dispute the lengths during the performance. The performance itself installs the order. The fact that later archaeology can verify some names only tightens the knot for us now. We project our categories two ways: myth and history. The list tolerates neither category, it replaces them with succession. Every so often, a small detail breaks through the monotony of format and reminds you there's a human hand behind it. The spacing where a longer name forces tighter wedges, the slight angling of a line. These are traces of the scribe's speed and training. They carry no commentary on content, but they remind you that the object is the product of a craft culture that valued fidelity. In that culture, correcting a narrative to fit a new idea of plausibility would be a fault. Copying the sequence as received would be the virtue. The lack of editorial breaks allows another effect. The list creates a felt continuity across the flood event. There is no visual or stylistic rupture. Readers later insert that boundary because we want cause and effect, reset and restart. The Prism's format says, simply, next. In that sense, the object enacts the very claim at the core of the tradition. Kingship moves, survives, resumes. If you expect the clay to dramatise the flood with gaps and exclamations, it won't. It keeps a metronome beat. That beat is the argument. When you reduce the prism to its essentials, format, tone, sequence, you see why it disturbs modern categories. The artifact behaves like a record. The content spans both the plausible and the impossible, and the two coexist without friction inside the same framework. A ledger that includes a miracle but treats it like an invoice leaves you with a choice. Either you discard the ledger, or you learn how to read what it preserves without demanding it change its voice. Most people prefer a warning label. The list offers none. So the mystery is not only the numbers, it's the confidence of the medium. A small clay prism, compact as a book you could slip into a satchel, speaks with the authority of administrative prose, and never acknowledges the boundary we look for, that calm is not an accident. It belongs to a tradition in which the past is a structure to maintain, not a story to revise. And once you grasp that, the next question is hard to avoid. If the format itself insists on continuity, what else in the record is carrying a memory we've trained ourselves not to hear? They called it a boundary, but it looks more like a break in the story. You stand at the edge of a trench in southern Iraq and the ground itself draws a hard line. Pale, compacted clay running smooth and featureless across the excavation, sealing what lies below from what grew above. Archaeologists call it a flood layer because that's what leaves a sheet like this. Water moving with force, then stillness, then silence. What unsettles everyone who works these sites is what the line separates. Under it, the world looks organised, planned, already thinking ahead. Above it, Sumer arrives with an answer that nobody remembers asking. Start at Eridu. This site unfolds as a staircase of earth and time, each step a temple platform rebuilt on the footprint of the last. The layers stack with careful continuity, foundations straightened, walls thickened, platforms lifted higher to stay clear of water. Then the clean clay horizon cuts through the sequence like a guillotine. Above it the city resumes, but now there's writing and standardized accounting marks and the first signs of formal law intertwined with ritual. The temple that had been rebuilt again and again before the water returns in a form anyone would recognize as a city centre. Administration, storage, ceremony and labour organised around a core that reads like a civic memory made physical. Move north to Nippur and the same contradiction holds. Deep in the excavation, below the sterile clay, the precinct already shows a logic. Preferred building materials selected for strength and water resistance, corridors aligned to open courtyards, doorway thresholds set to control flow through sanctified space. It is deliberate, not experimental. The clay layer sits on top, unmarked, like a lid. Above it, planning ramps up. The spaces become formalised. Standard units of measurement govern distances, and the administrative heart of the city begins to beat in regular pulses. Deliveries, rites, tax records, and the parade of seasons captured in marks on clay. At the line becomes personal. Workers clearing down through house floors find the tidy geometry of dwellings sealed by the same featureless clay. The rooms are compact but efficient. Storage platforms, hearth areas, drainage channels that send water where it needs to go. Mortar mixed with bitumen binds bricks against moisture. A technology that requires the knowledge of where to source the material and how to refine it for construction. The layer above flattens it all. When the city returns, streets straighten, courtyards repeat in modular patterns, and the first bureaucratic seals stamp clay tags with identities that will outlast their owners. Someone, somewhere, was already keeping track. After the water, they keep better track. Shuruppak, the city that later stories associate with survival, shows the same quiet competence under the clay. The pre-flood levels hold homes with standardized proportions and workshops organized to manage workflow. Storage jars line walls, and ceilings on containers suggest controlled distribution and accountability. It is not a village learning how to grow into a town. It is a networked settlement that knows how to scale. Then comes the uniform clay, and above it the same people, or new people holding old patterns, write their tallies, compute their rations, and formalise what was already there. Across these sites, the pattern won't let go. Shared architectural choices echo from city to city. Water management appears not as trial and error ditches, but as engineered channels shaped to the terrain. Trade markers show up as consistent materials moved over distance. Waterproofing agents extracted from geological sources. Stones that don't belong to the alluvial plain. Ceramics whose style travels farther than a household would wander. Beneath the line, it looks like a civilization without an alphabet. Above the line, the alphabet arrives already doing office work. The mud line is not a smear, it is a sheet. In many trenches it reads as a single coherent event, sediment laid down quickly, then left untouched long enough to compact into that stubborn, chalky barrier. It doesn't carry the chaos of toppled walls or churned debris you'd expect from slow decline. It carries the stillness of sudden interruption. Workers describe how their trowels slide from the gritty, artifact-rich layers into that clean clay with a change in sound you can hear. A duller scrape, a smoother push. Everything below is story. Everything above is recovery. What complicates the tidy explanation is the sophistication trapped under the seal. The pre-flood phases show a level of standardization that should belong to a system with records. Door widths repeat. Platform heights step up in consistent increments. Tools appear optimized for duties that assume a shared technique across distance. Even symbolic marks appear. Not writing yet, but signs placed in consistent contexts, like a vocabulary spoken without an alphabet. The flood line erases continuity in a physical sense, but it doesn't erase the template. When the cities come back, they pick up the same blueprints and add ledgers. Think about what that means. If the ground were showing us the birth of cities, we'd expect scatter, many experiments, many failures, and a slow convergence on best practices. Instead, we see aligned choices across far-flung sites, then an interruption, then a leap forward in formalization. That leap doesn't look like novelty, it looks like consolidation. Tools get names, quantities get units, work becomes countable, not just doable. Archaeologists walk a narrow path here. They don't assign motives to mud. They log elevations, colours, textures, sequences. But the pattern forces a question. Who taught the pre-flood world to build like that? The usual answer is time. Centuries of adaptation to the rivers and the marsh, knowledge passed down through stubborn practice. The problem is that the break doesn't show decline, it shows sealing, and the restart doesn't waver, it aligns. At Eridu, the temple sequence below the line grows in complexity as if each generation inherits a manual. Foundation packing gets denser, drainage improves, platforms rise with a regular cadence. Above the line, that cadence hardens into policy. The temple becomes an institution, not just a sacred place. Records appear to coordinate offerings and labour. The sacred and the administrative fuse in clay, and the city acts as if it remembers procedures even if its voice is new. At Nippur, spatial planning below the line favours processional movement and controlled access, already reflecting a theology embedded in architecture. Above the line, that theology acquires a calendar and a staff. Processions become scheduled, offerings become tallies, the same paths get walked, but now every step has a number. At the practical genius of marsh life under the line, bitumen sealing, platform building, water control, doesn't disappear. It scales. Canals get surveyed. Storage becomes inventory. The same materials move farther with a system that can measure shipping and loss. At Shuruppak, the workshop logic below the line expands into administration above it. Seal impressions begin to mark responsibility and ownership, assigning accountability in a way that outlives oral agreements. Those impressions are the faint echo of a voice that used to travel by memory. After the clay, memory goes into clay. The line itself becomes a character in this story, not a villain but a witness. It records impact in a language of silt and settling. It says the water stayed long enough to level the rough and smooth the small. It says people returned and rebuilt, not randomly, but with purpose that seems to have survived somewhere safe. Maybe in the heads of a few who learned the old patterns, maybe in ritual sequences that encoded procedures, maybe in caches of objects that served as prompts when words were gone. The line won't tell us which. It only shows us that the resumption was not blind. The paradox grows sharper as more sites echo the same rhythm. Pre-flood layers contain echoes of shared standards. Post-flood layers show those standards written into systems. The cities act like students who lost their notebooks and then recovered the outline of the course. They don't start over from counting pebbles. They reissue the syllabus and keep going. When the first tablets appear above the mudline, they do not sing epics, they count. Grain rations, work shifts, temple offerings, land allocations. This is not poetic memory, it is operational memory. The ground below the flood already operated. The ground above the flood writes down how. So the line in the earth does more than divide layers. It splits how we think about beginnings. If the start of civilization were an invention, we'd expect argument and drift. What the ground gives us is rehearsal below, program above. The rehearsal is long and disciplined. The program runs on schedule. This is why the clean clay horizon unsettles. It is the physical trace of a reset that did not break the pattern. It is the moment the medium changes from human memory and habit to human memory and marks. The content persists, the storage evolves. When researchers map these sequences across the plane, the same motif repeats enough times to become the baseline. That pushes a different kind of question to the front. Where did the baseline come from? If those pre-flood cities were already working from a guide, then the first written cities are not inventors but editors. They take a working draft and make it legible. The mudline keeps its secrets. It won't name names or spell out causes. But it does fix a boundary in time where a civilization that already knew how to live together learned how to record that knowledge in a way that could outlast another break. That's the quiet twist buried in the trenches. The ground beneath the flood looks like Chapter 3. The ground above reads like Chapter 4 with headers and footnotes, which means the search for origins does not stop at the clay. It passes through it. If the organisation below survived into the world above, then the source of that organisation lies deeper still, in layers we haven't reached, or in landscapes now under water or sand. The line is not the end of the question. It is the start of a trail that leads back before the flood into the part of the story where memory travelled without tablets and architecture spoke for belief. Step down past the clean slice of clay and you enter a layer that doesn't behave like a beginning. It looks organised from the start. Rectangular houses cluster in planned rows, courtyards, face-shared workspaces, and the settlement holds its shape across centuries rather than drifting randomly like a camp. The pottery is uniform enough to suggest training and standard tools. The floors are plastered with care and repaired in cycles. The canals run to fixed points and return in loops. That's the strangeness. This older world did not grope in the dark. It operated on templates. The names are later, the writing is later, but the habits are already there. Well formed, quietly disciplined. Archaeologists call this horizon Ubaid. It rises in layers beneath later cities and spreads with a steady hand across the southern plains and marshlands. The houses tend toward right angles, the rooms repeat in patterns. The settlements sit on slight rises above wet ground, as if following a manual for flood-prone terrain. The same types of clay cones, the same choices for bricks, the same roof spans appear over and over along a wide arc from the delta inland. There is no burst of experimentation. The plan arrives, gets applied, and holds. That steadiness runs through their layouts. Some sites show centralised platforms that anchor the whole community. Smaller rooms cluster around broad halls with benches and basins. Narrow lanes link house to house and drain toward managed channels. Storage pits align with thresholds. Thresholds align with sightlines. The planning suggests rules held in shared memory, not slogans on walls. Yet there is no text to decode the rules, no charter, no inscriptions, only repetition so consistent it feels deliberate. Here's the paradox. The Ubaid people built in teams. They organised fields, water and labour at a scale bigger than a village. They tracked movement of goods across serious distances. Their ritual practices anchored communities because the same building types recur at the centre of settlement after settlement. They managed risk in a landscape that punished mistakes, but they left nothing to tell us where their model came from or why they kept it so stable. They lived like heirs and left no will. The most striking case sits under later Eridu. Dig down through the later brickwork and you hit the early platform, then another below it, then another, a staircase of foundations reaching into older clay. Each reconstruction preserves the footprint but tweaks the proportions, adds a room, raises the platform, thickens the walls. The sequence is patient. It unfolds like a long craft apprenticeship, master teaching apprentice, apprentice becoming master, over generations. No text names the god of the place at this stage. No hymn tells us the rites. What we have is the muscle memory of builders. Keep the axis, raise the threshold, widen the hall, reset the drainage. Faith expressed as insistence on doing the same work again but better. Across the delta, the same hands, if not literally then in method, touch other sites. The ceramic style holds together from one settlement to the next, with regional accents but a shared grammar. We find bowls with fine, thin walls and balanced profiles that require tight control of the wheel or careful hand building. Surfaces carry a muted palette, reserved bands, and simple geometric fields. It reads as taste shaped by a school, not a scatter of individual preferences. This coherence is hard to square with the absence of writing, because standardization at that scale usually rides with lists, counts, and rules. Here, the standard lives in practice. Trade paths run through this world like buried wires. Ubaid ware turns up along the Arabian Gulf coast. It travels by water, because the marsh channels and nearshore routes connect these plains to distant harbours. Hard volcanic glass arrives from the north, traceable to mountain zones where such stone breaks into razor edges. Thick black bitumen appears in joints and waterproof layers. It comes from distinct geological sources, not local, carried by boat and cart to seal baskets, line basins and bind bricks. Every movement implies contacts, agreements, and regular exchange. Someone kept track, even if the ledger lay in memory or on perishable surfaces we have not found. Their irrigation shows the same quiet engineering. Canals step off natural levees and carry water along controlled gradients to fields planted on raised plots. Spillways and cut-offs tell us they understood flow and failure. Sediment traps sit where they need to sit, not where convenience would put them. In some places, lines of posts and reed matting form breakwaters against seasonal surges. Over time, channels bend and get replaced, but the pattern persists. Shape the marsh, don't fight it. Feed the fields, then drain them. Bring the water in, send it back out clean enough to avoid rot at the edges where houses meet channels. Tools and tasks fill out the picture. We see specialised blades for cutting reeds and harvesting cereals. We see heavy pounders for processing grain, neatly ground to fit the hand. We see bone awls for fine work on textiles and basketry. Kilns reach temperatures that require careful control of fuel and airflow. Clay sickles and later, inserts of sharper stone hint at an economy tuned to harvest schedules and repair cycles. None of this looks experimental. It looks practiced. Look out over that landscape. Marsh reeds stand in lines where humans forced them to grow. Levees hold the water back just long enough to soak narrow plots. Low platforms rise above wet ground, layered with tamped fill and brick, sturdy enough to take a roof and a crowd. Ramps climb the sides. Open edges frame views toward channels and fields. From platform to house to waterway, the system links together. The most remarkable quality is its stability. Centuries pass and the scheme holds, with small changes that reflect refinement rather than invention. Ritual sits at the centre of this calm. The repeated rebuilding of central platforms, the deposition of specific objects in walls or corners, the maintenance of processional lines through doorways and across courtyards all suggest repeatable ceremonies. The paraphernalia is modest. Vessels, figurines, carefully placed stones, but consistent. Without text, we can only read the choreography set in brick. The choreography says, gather here, move along this line, face this direction, ascend and disperse. Large, formal, but not ostentatious. A community rehearsing an inherited script without a written stage direction. Then the line in the ground interrupts everything. Above the sterile mud, we meet cities that know writing. We meet accounting thrust into clay. signs fixed for names, numbers, measures. We see new building scales, new monument heights, new administrative devices. The jump looks less like a slow build and more like a threshold crossed. That is the source of the tension. The earlier world had the scaffold, planned spaces, shared rules, skilled labour, far trade, controlled water, ritual precision. But it never crosses into recorded law or explicit doctrine. Then, over the mud, the ledger appears with a full set of symbols. Why does the Ubaid story end so cleanly, as if someone closed the cover on a long chapter? The layer that separates eras lies heavy between them. Under it, the settlements maintain repeating order. Over it, the writing speaks. If we take the archaeology at face value, the earlier system kept civilization's skeleton alive. Architecture that taught itself, water that obeyed rules, exchange that kept its timing. Yet the voice of that world is absent. The knowledge moves, but the words do not. That is the unsettling part. It feels intentional, as if memory favoured techniques over tales, because techniques survive shocks better. The trade web helps explain the continuity. Techniques migrate with people who can teach by doing. A potter can train another with a wheel and a day of clay. A canal builder can show slope with a cord and a stake. A planner can lay out a courtyard with foot measures and reputation. Written rules matter less when the community transmits method by apprenticeship and ritual. A flood can strip walls and scatter vessels, but it cannot erase the feel of a level string pulled tight, or the sound a proper joint makes when bitumen seals it. So the Ubaid layers begin to look like a conservatory for civil order. They keep the time, tend the craft, and preserve the course of water. They do not write down the curriculum. That silence may be the point. If their task was to hold a pattern through uncertainty, then redundancy in practice mattered more than innovation in ideas. The emphasis on rectangular rooms and repeated footprints makes sense under that mission. The marsh teaches patience. The rivers punish haste. The safe way is the taught way. When later cities rise, the continuity shows through their foundations. Urban planners reuse alignments that suit levees and channels. Builders inherit the logic of platforms above floodlines. Administrators inherit the habit of central precincts that organize space and ritual. The additions, script, formal weights, cylinder seals, snap into place as if the spaces were waiting for them. It reads not as invention from nothing, but as activation of latent slots in a system already framed. This raises a hard possibility. The Ubaid horizon may not be the first time someone worked out this pattern. Its completeness without text hints at a deeper source. The communities behave like caretakers. They show restraint in ornament and persistence in layout. They hold the line on standards even as sites shift and reforms accrue. They carry practices that fit environments similar to those that later Sumerian cities occupy. It is plausible that they protected a template inherited by training and ritual from an earlier unrecorded phase. The flood line then marks a break in media, not in knowledge. Below, memory stored in habits. Above, memory stored in clay. That would explain the abrupt clarity of the next age, writing slots into a culture that already counts, weighs, and schedules. Astronomical observations slots into a ritual calendar that already moves people at the right hours. Law codes slot into a community that already accepts authority at the platform and the courtyard. When the voice finally returns, it speaks into rooms designed generations earlier to host it. So the quiet world beneath the mud stops looking like a preface and starts looking like a bridge. It carries forward architecture, water logic, craft sequences, and ritual routes through time. It lacks the things we often mistake for the beginning of civilization because those things are loud, texts, titles, boasts. But the bones are older than the proclamations. The habits are older than the boasts. If that is right, then the oldest post-flood cities are not inventors so much as rememberers. They rebuild according to measures held in hands and eyes, not yet on tablets. They align to channels because their teachers taught them the cost of ignoring water. They raise platforms because the ground taught them to respect altitude by inches. When the tablets appear, they record a world already in motion, one that knew where to place its doors and where to bury its drains, which brings us back to the threshold. Standing at the cut, you see two orders of memory separated by clay. Below, traditions behave like tools. Above, they crystallize into signs. The continuity between them suggests a long rehearsal for the return of a script, and when the script arrives, it reads like a reminder more than a revelation. The story above the flood line doesn't unfold like invention. It reappears like recall. When Eridu rises again, it does so with a plan in hand. A central temple platform set on a raised mound, axial alignment locked to cardinal directions, and precinct boundaries that sort sacred from domestic space. The earliest levels show reed and mud architecture transitioning to fired brick, with a clear template for how rooms, courtyards and storage should interlock. That plan doesn't evolve through scattered experiments. It arrives as a coherent model and is then replicated in nearby settlements. Uruk does the same on a grander scale. The Anna precinct doesn't grow like a village that found itself. It presents as a program. Enclosures define open plazas. Processional routes control movement. Specialized buildings separate administrative storage from ritual structures. Clay tablets appear not as doodles or lists of names, but as ration counts, standardized measures, and commodity flows that require a community already operating with quotas, labor divisions, and a calendar. Writing begins as an instrument because accounting already exists. The underlying system shows precedence over the symbols used to capture it. When the first tablets record barley, oil, and wool, they use measures consistent across sites. The signs for numbers plug into a base 60 framework that handles fractions with ease. Geometry enters in service to field surveying and canal maintenance. Workers deploy right angles and standard lengths to keep water moving and boundaries stable. This is not an art project. It is civil engineering backed by notation. Cities behave like institutions that remember their manuals even if their library burned. Art points to the same pattern. Cylinder seals do not meander through random motifs. Craftsmen carve repeating iconography tied to office, trade, and cult roles. The seals function as signatures and keys, proving identity in a bureaucracy that expects verification. That kind of social trust system takes time to develop, unless the people arriving already know how to formalize obligations and audit fulfillment. When those seals pass from one generation to the next, we see continuity of office, roles that outlast individuals because process outlasts memory. Water management speaks the loudest. Canals do not snake at whim. They conform to gradients mapped with care, embankments shored with baskets of reeds and bitumen cap, gates positioned to distribute flow across fields without eroding banks. To maintain a canal network over seasons, you need scheduling, labour rosters and maintenance logs. You need penalties for neglect and credit for completion. Early tablets do not narrate heroic deeds. They track deliveries and work days. The banal details of functioning systems come first because the system already functions. Religious architecture doubles as urban management. Ziggurat platforms are not just statements. They are reliable high ground that protects archives and idols from rising water. Temple storehouses stabilise surplus in years when the river misbehaves. Priestly offices collect and redistribute goods on timetables tied to lunar markers, which means observation routines are baked into ritual. The calendar is not decorative, it runs the city. When a city times offerings to the new moon, it also times rent, corvée and harvest schedules to the same clock. Ritual creates compliance. We also see modularity that suggests templates rather than trial. Courtyard houses repeat spatial logic, inward-facing rooms around a central void, with a drain route and a private well or shared access trunk. Workshops cluster near thoroughfares. Kilns sit downwind. The plan minimises conflict between smoke, storage, and living space. Someone learned those lessons and wrote them into the ground. The consistency across sites tells us the lessons travelled, not the accidents. Why call this already knowing? Because the start of writing, math and city form behaves like a third draft. The earliest cuneiform tablets jump straight into compound signs and mixed systems that track both goods and personnel. The number signs distinguish between counting animals and measuring grain, which signals a tax code embedded in symbols. You don't invent that distinction on day one. You make it because disputes have already happened and policy resolved them. The symbols show law in negative space. Astronomical habits slip in at the edges. Temple orientations favour cardinal points and significant risings that require long observation to fix. Seasonal labour calendars match water schedules, which means the city times field work by the sky and the river together. The pairing of lunar months with intercalation to match the solar year appears with administrative need, not poetic curiosity. Without that intercalation system, accounts drift and fairs miss crops. Its presence indicates a feedback loop between observation and logistics that only a sustained operation would require. Trade networks snap into place without warm-up. Standardized weights move across regions. Ceilings show goods sealed at origin and inspected at destination. Caravans arrive with specialized items and leave with surplus staples, implying contracts and risk sharing. When merchants trust a weight, they trust a legal zone. Trust over distance is not impulsive. It grows from precedent, and precedent needs recording. The city that writes is the city that remembers ongoing obligations. Even the way Sumerian scribes learn reflects continuity. The earliest school tablets copy sign lists, numerical tables, and model contracts. Students don't invent signs. They memorize canon. They drill metrology, then apply it to sample cases. That format reveals both a tradition and an objective. Produce functionaries who can slot into a machine that pre-exists them. The machine is the city. The city is the memory. Architecture scales as if guided by rules, not by whim. When Uruk expands beyond its walls, it repeats neighbourhoods in regular layouts. Streets respect widths and angles that facilitate drainage and movement of carts. Public spaces serve crowd control and market exchange with sightlines toward authority buildings. This is not an organic sprawl that later gets organised. Organisation defines growth at each step. The underlying idea, city as instrument, stays steady while the instrument grows louder. The same goes for metallurgy and craft specialisation. Workshops limit cross-contamination, metal working away from textile dyeing, kilns separated from food storage, slag piles in designated dumps, toolkits specialise by trade, and moulds produce uniform outputs. Standardisation indicates orders placed with specifications, not a craftsperson guessing. Specifications point to administrators who think in quantities, deadlines, and quality thresholds. Their existence is the quiet proof of memory made practical. Why does this matter for the larger mystery? Because the jump from pre-flood organisation to post-flood cities is not a leap from simple to complex. It's a swap from undocumented systems to documented ones. The bones of the system, managed water, modular houses, ritual calendars, stored surplus, were already there. What changes above the mud is the decision to write them down and scale them hard. That decision looks less like discovery and more like restoration under new constraints. There is a pattern to how restoration proceeds. First, secure food and water using known schemes. Then, set ritual and timekeeping to synchronize labour. Next, standardise measures and ceilings to expand trade. Finally, formalise memory with writing so the city can persist beyond living recollection. In Sumer, those steps appear layered but compacted, like someone following a manual quickly, because the window for stability is narrow. The flood may have erased libraries, but not the habits of those who'd used them. Consider how myths talk about foundation. They say kingship descended, not because authority dropped from the sky, but because legitimacy came from a pre-existing order held outside the chaos. The city that receives kingship is adopting a template and the right to apply it. When multiple cities claim turns at custody of that template, they are asserting guardianship over the model, not the invention of it. Rotation fits a world that treats civilization as a trust, not a trophy. So cities above the mud act like trustees. They carry forward alignment schemes, account rhythms, and institutional roles that make complex life possible. They look back only to confirm that their rebuild still matches the old standard. The speed and coherence of their growth makes sense if what they rebuild is less about creativity and more about fidelity. And that is why the streets of Uruk and the terraces of Eridu feel like memory made out of brick. They are. Kingship, they said, descended from heaven. Not invented, not negotiated, not fought into existence. Delivered. The King List opens with that claim, and for the cities that trace their authority back to it, that line is more than a slogan. It sets the frame for why power in Mesopotamia carried ritual weight that law or weapons alone could not explain. If rule originated outside human hands, then the work of a king was not to build legitimacy from scratch, but to receive it, maintain it, and keep it in tune with something older than the city itself. That is why the list ties kingship to places, not people, and why the story begins at Eridu. The first city is less a settlement than a station where order touched down. Eridu matters because it anchors the claim to a location you can still excavate. Deep beneath later construction lies a long sequence of temple platforms, each rebuilt on the last, as if the ground demanded that height be maintained for reasons that outlived any single ruler. In the narratives, this is Enki's city. Not a sky god, but a lord of the fresh waters under the earth, the Abzu, the quiet source that rises in springs and canals. The logic is clear. If kingship arrives from beyond, it needs a storage place, a reservoir. Enki's domain is that reservoir, literal and symbolic, and the city built on its edge becomes the first administrative centre for what the texts call the Me. The Me are not vague blessings, they are named categories of civilized life. Ordinances, crafts, priestly offices, musical forms, ritual sequences, even emotional states. In the stories, these are items you can lose, steal, misapply and restore. That implies a clerical mindset about culture, as if order consists of transferable modules, each with a right owner, a right use, and a right ritual. When the Me sit with Enki, civilization has its archive. When they are distributed to cities, institutions awaken and societies take on distinct styles. The King List's claim about kingship lands neatly here. A ruler holds power because the city holds the Me. His job is to keep the connection intact. Enlil, by contrast, governs the space where order moves. If Enki is storage and specification, Enlil is authority and enforcement, wind, word and boundary. In the temple lists and hymns, Enlil's city Nippur is where decrees gain force. The pairing sets up a simple pattern. A city becomes legitimate when Enki's stored knowledge and Enlil's command align. Kingship travels when that alignment shifts. That helps explain why the King List shows rule relocating from one city to another after crises. When a catastrophe disrupts the civic pattern, legitimacy reattaches where those two poles, knowledge and mandate, can be brought back into balance. The flood narratives sharpen this. They say a reset hit. Humanity nearly disappeared, and the Me had to survive that break. In those stories, Enki acts not as a destroyer or a judge, but as a custodian who refuses to let the archive vanish. He warns, he preserves, he ensures the continuity of seeds, skills and records. That casts kingship after the flood in a new light. A post-cataclysm ruler is not mainly a conqueror, he is a restorer. His first duty is to re-establish the channels between the Abzu's stored order and the world above, the canals, the calendrical rites, the temple economies, the legal norms. The claim that kingship returned to Eridu first after the flood tracks with this logic. You restart where the archive survives. You can read the temple as a machine built to maintain that connection. Its foundations reach into the water table. Its upper stages mark the sky. Processions and rituals move along fixed paths like data pipelines. Offerings, measured in exact quantities, travel on schedules tied to lunar stations and market cycles. The king stands at the point where these flows intersect, embodying rites that no individual can generate. When the me circulate properly, the city runs. When they are monopolized, stolen, or misassigned, things break. In some myths, Enki lends the me out, even lets them wander, as if testing whether a city can bear a particular office or art. The failure is not random. It exposes mismatches between a community's capacity and the burden of a given me. Because the me are itemized, kingship becomes audit-friendly. That might sound dry, but it explains why Mesopotamian power is procedural. Oaths, standard weights, seals, and installation rites aren't pageantry. They're interfaces to the divine storehouse. An enthronement is a handover. A canal opening is a covenant renewal with the groundwater realm. A tax schedule is a timetable that matches the beat of the moon and the work of fields. In this frame, a king who breaks procedure severs the line between archive and administration. Famine and revolt are not punishments from angry gods in a modern sense. They are systemic failures following breaches in the chain of custody. The division between Enki and Enlil also maps onto the geography of power. Eridu anchors the marsh edge, the wet, rich, unruly south. Nippur marks the central staging ground, the high, dry, distributive middle. When rule toggles between cities in the King List, we watch a negotiation between resource bases and command centres. The stories preserve those shifts as theological moves. Enlil grants, removes, or transfers kingship. Enki equips and advises. That duality keeps the system resilient. When one pole is compromised, the other can safeguard the me until the line can be restored. After the flood, the texts say kingship descends again. The phrasing matters because it avoids the language of invention. The idea that order comes from outside normal time, down rather than up, lets the chroniclers treat disruptions as intermissions, not failures. The me don't evolve, they reappear. Cities don't innovate, they remember and rebuild. Even political reform becomes framed as a recovery of the proper distribution of me. When a ruler claims to establish justice, he's not drafting something new. He's putting the correct tablet back into the correct archive and reopening the channel to Enlil's decree. This way of thinking can absorb foreign influence and new techniques without admitting rupture. A novel craft can be justified as brought up from the Abzu, an art retrieved from the flood's edge, a ritual reordered to match older patterns. It also turns legitimacy contests into arguments about custody. Who has the charter? Whose temple holds the versions that match what Enki preserved? Competing dynasties fight with bricks and spears, but they win with inscriptions that claim the right lineage of me. Take the line that kingship begins at Eridu. In everyday terms, it tells later rulers where to send offerings, if they want their authority to carry the original stamp. In deeper terms, it points to a historical memory that the first stable order grew out of canal building, water management, and the quiet, granular work of storage and distribution. A power that forgets its source in the Abzu, grain, fish, date palms, clay, is a power that will fail when the sky turns harsh. That is why Enki's wisdom is depicted as both technical and moral. Alignment with the waters means you keep measures honest, boundaries clean, and schedules predictable. When kingship deviates, floods and dust fill the gap. Enlil's role keeps that memory from becoming passive. Kings must act. Orders must be spoken. Boundaries must be enforced. The wind god's temple is where abstraction becomes policy. There, decrees are not suggestions. They are forms that cut channels for behaviour. The blend of Enki and Enlil keeps the system from drifting into either dry bureaucracy or charismatic license. You need stored standards, and you need living authority. You need a past that anchors and a voice that commands. If the me survived a near extinction, their transmission cannot be casual. That is why the myths load so much weight onto ritual correctness, and why the King List treats certain cities as custodial waypoints. When kingship moves to a new city, the public story says heaven chose it, but the inner logic says the archive found a safer home or a stronger steward. In practice, that might mean a city with better flood defences, more reliable granaries, or a priesthood skilled at calendars. Myth compresses those checks into one sentence. Archaeology stretches them across foundations, ceramics, and drainage. There is a hard edge to this model. If every institution is a me with a proper holder, then usurpation is a technical error, not just a political crime. A traitor is someone who takes a me he cannot sustain. The aftermath is predictable. Rituals fail, drought bites, armies falter. Restoring order becomes a controlled rollback. You return the me to the right temple, repair the canal that connects the Abzu to the fields, retime the festivals to match the moon, and let Enlil's decree reassert the boundaries that keep randomness out. The persistence of this logic explains the list's calm treatment of impossible rains before the flood and modest rains after. Different scales, same framework. Before the reset, time is a slastic. After it, time snaps back into administrative cycles. What does not change is the claim that legitimate power is derivative. It is granted, held in trust, and measurable against standards that humans do not author. That makes the king a steward of memory as much as a commander of men. Eridu's primacy signals one more layer. If your first city sits by the Abzu, your first lesson is that wealth flows from controlled water. That means your first me are the tools of regulation, the reed measure, the clay bulla, the notarized seal. The act of ruling starts with accounting. Enki's wisdom, in that sense, is the wisdom of limits. He is generous with forms but strict about fit. He will let a city borrow the me of musical power, but if it cannot carry that weight without breaking its channels, he will call them back. When later kings invoke descent from heaven, they are not claiming divinity, they are claiming access. They say their city has the line open, the archive intact, the voice of decree aligned with the stored pattern. Whether they achieve that in practice is the test their eras must pass. The king list keeps score by where kingship resides, not by how kings behave. It records custody, not character. In a world built to survive resets, custody is the story that matters. So the phrase that opens the chronicle does more than dignify monarchy. It preserves a technical theory of civilization. Order comes from a source outside human invention. Knowledge is modular and must be assigned correctly. Authority must match specification, and survival depends on maintaining the channels between storage and command. After a world-ending flood, that theory becomes a survival kit. A city that rebuilds with it can stand up fast. A city that forgets it may rise brilliantly and collapse just as quickly when the channels silt shut. Time still runs in 60s because of people who rose out of floodplains built their math on a base the human hand can't count to. We divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees, then trust those divisions to fly planes, draw property lines, measure stars, and sync global networks. None of that came out of trial and error tinkering in the Bronze Age workshop. It arrived already coherent, with a logic that scales from clay tablets to satellites. The question is why base 60 shows up fully grown in the earliest records, and why the world never walked away from it. Start with the clay. The oldest numerical tablets of southern Mesopotamia show place value writing that treats numbers as positions and symbols rather than marks in a row. Different tokens and wedges carry meaning that depends on where they sit, which is the foundation of abstract calculation. Base 60 fits that system cleanly. It breaks down into many factors: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. So merchants, builders, and surveyors could split, combine, and convert without messy remainders. Half of 60 is neat. A third is neat. A fifth is neat. Fractions become friendlier when the base plays well with divisors, and Mesopotamian life needed fractions for rationing grain, measuring fields and tracking shares of cargo on rivers that made and broke fortunes. Their tablets show tables of reciprocals and squares set out for training scribes. A student learned to flip a number into its multiplicative partner, then use it to divide by multiplication. Most of the pairs work best in a sexagesimal world. Try to divide by 3 in base 10, and you meet repeating decimals. Do it in base 60, and the result resolves in a single step. The culture's go-to problems, how many bricks for a temple wall, what length of canal will deliver the right slope, which lot lines meet at right angles, become practical in a base that makes division cooperative instead of stubborn. Astronomy locked the choice in. The sky moves at a tidy pace when you frame it in 60s and 360 seconds. The sun's daily path across the horizon maps well to 360 degrees, and dividing that circle into 12 segments of 30 created a scheme that harmonized with months, seasons, and a busy calendar of rites. Hours become easier when the day splits in half and each half divides again. Minutes and seconds are natural offspring of the system, not later add-ons. Once you adopt that lattice, timing eclipses, tracking rising stars at dawn, and predicting the return of Venus become problems of counting steps in a cycle rather than inventing new units each time. Geometry followed the same track. Surveyors pegged fields after floods and needed to rebuild boundaries downstream of shifting levees. A 360-degree circle let angles translate into ropes and stakes work across long stretches of land. Triangles and rectangles could be decomposed into repeatable units. When you can segment a rotation into dozens and then into small exact parts, aligning canals and streets becomes a matter of ratio, not guesswork. The same ratios show up in brick dimensions and wall batter, where the face tilts at a predictable angle for stability. That consistency explains why Mesopotamian building projects scale from shrines to city walls with the same proportions and measures. The sexagesimal habit reached into administration. Early lists tally jars of oil, loaves of bread, measures of barley, and lengths of cloth using standardized units that convert up and down the ladder of 60. Warehouse ledgers group items in 60s and 60ths, making totals and distributions easy to check. Contracts tolerating no ambiguity rely on a base that keeps errors from compounding. When scribes carry numbers forward across columns, the place value structure acts as a safety rail. The habit of double entry counting and cross-checking against reciprocals grows naturally out of a place value base that invites verification by inversion. Skeptics sometimes call base 60 a messy hybrid, assembled from a base 10 body with base 6 or base 12 grafted on. That misses how coherent the resulting organism is. 10 fingers invite a decimal scheme, but human experience involved more than hands. Counting by knuckles makes 12s easy, and pairing 12s with 5s yields 60s without forcing the math. Shepherds counting flocks and sailors counting days at sea both benefit from a base that matches the way cycles present themselves in nature and craft. 60 solves more daily problems than 10 does when you need clean partitions, and those solutions are reflected in the tables and exercises that trainee scribes copied for years. A key point sits quietly in the archival layers. The sophistication arrives early. The oldest surviving astronomical texts from Mesopotamian tradition handle angular measures in degrees and time in sexagesimal units as established practice. They do not read like experiments or proposals, they read like users of a system working through long cycles with confidence in the underlying framework. The accuracy of their eclipse interval tracking and planetary period lists assumes a numerical base that can be subdivided and recombined without friction. It also assumes that the culture cared about harmonizing number, time, and space into one toolkit. Transportation locked that toolkit to geography. Rivers demanded scheduling. Couriers moved by day length and landmarks rather than constant speed on fixed roads. Calculating travel estimates and ration allotments for a team moving upstream against current with stopovers becomes more precise when your time units split evenly. If a cargo team advances a certain number of 60ths of a day per reach, a planner can tally how many rations make the round trip without running dry. This looks mundane until you realise it frames logistics in a structure that can scale up to intercity trade and state-led projects with consistent accounting. Where did this base come from? The archaeological record shows the Ubaid and Uruk horizons setting down standardised measures and administrative tokens before fully fledged cuneiform. The mathematics appears alongside bureaucracy rather than following it. Systems that handle large labour pools, long irrigation lines and multi-city exchange networks need flexible arithmetic from the start. Sexagesimal meets that need. If communities were rebuilding after a disruptive flood episode, as the excavation layers suggest, they would draw on the most resilient compressible knowledge. A base that encodes flexibility would be first to return because it supports everything else. Astronomy pushes the thought further. Ancient temples aligned cardinal directions and rising points of notable stars. Maintaining those alignments across centuries demands awareness that the sky drifts slowly. A base with fine subdivisions lets observers track small changes over long periods with consistent notation. Even without naming the drift, the numbers handle it. Eclipse prediction and Venus cycle scheduling rely on repeating patterns that fit neatly into sexagesimal note-taking. The system acts as a memory device that outlasts individual lifetimes, carrying observations forward with minimal loss because the conversion steps are easy and exact. This ease breeds reach. When later civilizations adopt degrees, minutes and seconds for navigation, they inherit a scaffold built for rivers and fields and apply it to oceans and maps. Triangulation across long distances depends on angles that can be split and measured with a handheld instrument. The choice of base affects the precision of every instrument tied to angle or time. Sextants, clocks, and eventually satellites live inside the same architecture that once counted barley. The endurance of base 60 is not nostalgia. It persists because it continues to solve problems in a way that reduces conversion errors and keeps fractions from spiralling into approximations. There's a deeper question under the utility. Why does the earliest phase of cities show a mature numeric world view? A reasonable answer is that people carried it through disruption because it compresses. Oral training can pass down tables of reciprocals, squares, and factor relationships as chants and exercises. Scribes didn't need machines. They needed rules that are easy to memorize and reuse. 60's factor-rich nature makes for short, stable lists. In a world where writing was precious and fragile, knowledge that fits into heads and can be reconstructed from a few principal tables stands a better chance of surviving. We see hints of this in how problems are worded on student tablets. They pose real tasks. A canal with a given drop must run a certain length to deliver water at the right speed. A field of a given area must be fenced with a limited number of posts. A pile of bricks must build a wall of target dimensions. Underneath every scenario is a dance of ratios. The sexagesimal base keeps those ratios crisp, reduces rounding, and allows back-checking with reciprocals. That culture valued reversibility. If you can multiply forward, you can divide backward to test your work. The base makes verification a habit. The reach into the sky comes back to Earth when you consider land surveys after floods. Boundaries washed away had to be restored in a way everyone recognised as fair. Angles, lengths, and areas needed to match prior records. A base that breaks down into many divisors lets a surveyor reconstruct partial plots and compensate neighbours without accumulating fractional leftovers. That sort of arithmetic discourages conflict. In a landscape where social peace depends on credible measures, sexagesimal arithmetic isn't abstract. It is civic glue. Today, when your phone locks onto satellites and maps a route turn by turn, it dissolves angular distances into degrees, minutes, and seconds. When a trading algorithm timestamps a bid, it parcels time in 60ths. When an engineer calibrates a machine tool, the control software steps through arcs and rotations in the same units that once measured temple corners. The continuity isn't accidental. Systems that reduce friction gain users and become hard to replace. Base 10 is fine for counting cash. Base 60 plays better with cycles, ratios and angles, and those govern more of the built world than we notice. That's why the math looks older than the cities where we find it. It behaves like a survivor, not an invention. It fits a society concerned with reconstruction and long-term planning, one that needs to set stones straight, ration water, schedule festivals to celestial signals, and reconcile ledgers after upheaval. If memory is a bridge across deep water, sexagesimal math is part of the decking. It carries weight, flexes without breaking, and connects tasks that look unrelated until they align on a base that makes divisions gentle and returns certain. And once a culture steps onto that bridge, every crossing afterward tends to follow the same planks. We left off with numbers that behave like memory devices. Now we step outside the clay and look up. The Sumerians built temples that functioned as observatories, and they embedded sky knowledge into brick, bitumen, and ritual timing. This is where the story raises a new problem. Some of what those structures seem to encode matches cycles that are hard to reconstruct without very long records. Not guesses, not folklore, repeatable patterns that ask for patient measurement across centuries. Yet these patterns appear in the earliest layers where writing shows up. No warm-up period, no trial notebooks, no apprentice notes in the margins. The sky data arrives already settled. Start with the most obvious cycle you can see without tools, the path of the sun and the wandering planets along a fixed zone. The Sumerians had a band of constellations through which the planets travelled, a set that later cultures formalised as the zodiac. The alignment of temple courtyards and gateways in places like Uruk and Nippur tracks. Sunrise and sunset points at key dates, neatly allowing priests to calibrate rituals to the turning year. Alignments on solstices and equinoxes are expected for any agrarian society, but what follows pushes beyond basic farming needs. Some temple foundations preserve axial orientations that only match sunrise positions during epochs that precede the known lifetimes of the structures above them, suggesting builders referenced an older standard of the heavens when laying out their ground plans. Now shift to the moon. Eclipses are predictable, but only if you track the lunar months against the sun for many years. The Sumerian scribal tradition used repeating units of time that line up with known eclipse intervals. Festival calendars, intercalation practices, and the habit of inserting extra months to keep the lunar year in phase point to careful, long-term observation. A cycle near 18 years in length governs how solar and lunar eclipses repeat. In later texts, the arithmetic scheme becomes explicit, but the operational knowledge appears early, buried in scheduling rules and in the way offerings and omens tie to lunar positions. This is not random superstition. This is management of a complex clock where the sun and moon gear together. Venus adds another gear. The bright morning and evening star shifts through a pattern that repeats against the year over a sequence just short of 8 solar years. That loop matters for tracking river levels, planting and omens in later periods, but the habits of watching it begin in the Sumerian horizon. Temple rites call for specific actions when an inner planet rises in particular sectors. Doorways and sightlines facing low on the horizon enable visibility of first and last appearances, where a degree or two matters. When a temple is laid out to capture a narrow window on the east, and that window lines up with heliacal appearances of Venus during certain epochs, you learn that the builders were not only honouring a deity, they were fixing an observational baseline into the city itself. Then there is a slower movement, the one that strains belief without a written astronomy textbook, the steady drift of the backdrop of stars against the seasonal markers. Over long stretches, the orientation of the sky at solstices and equinoxes slides through the constellations. The effect is too slow to notice in a lifetime, yet some of the earlier star names and roles embedded in lists assign positions that match periods before the cities in which the lists were found reach their peak. If a constellation's identity connects to a seasonal point it no longer occupies, then either the label comes from an older tradition, or the calendar framework itself migrated through time. That mismatch is a clue. It says the map in the mind of the scribe was older than the bricks around him. The shapes in those constellations present another puzzle. Some align with known animal and tool motifs that appear across a wide region. The recurrence of specific figures in multiple cultures can result from contact, trade, or shared origin. What raises eyebrows is how certain groupings match star fields that only make cultural sense when tied to seasonal functions from earlier epochs. Constellations used for river timing, boat festivals, or harvest rites are anchored to the year's turning points. When those figures keep their ritual roles even as the sky slowly shifts, tradition must carry the memory of where the stars used to be. That is legacy, not accident. Consider the way temples doubled as timekeepers. Their stepped platforms elevate observers above haze. Their corners align to cardinal points, locking in a long baseline for measuring changes in sunrise azimuth over decades. Add wall niches and sighting stones, and you have fixed reference points to register the moon's extremes at northern and southern standstills, events that require tracking over many years. In some precincts, the secondary chapels and outer courtyards line up with the directions of major star risings. These choices are costly if they do not serve a function. They pay off if they encode a calendar into the city's circulation, turning processions into moving measurement. Calendars are where the sky becomes practical. Agricultural cycles in Mesopotamia need precise timing through wet and dry transitions. Early administrative tablets show ration distributions and labour schedules keyed to named months tied to celestial events. When a month begins with the first visible crescent, the whole system depends on calibrated observation. Slight errors compound. The response to this risk is not vague ceremony, but rules. When clouds hide the crescent, extend the count. When the moon is late, adjust. Behind those rules sits an understanding that the sky runs on tight tolerances, and people built buffers into the system to keep it stable. Stone and clay also preserve star lists. Simple lists matter because they show which stars were important and in what order. When a list assigns a star to a god's seat, then temple liturgy attaches to a point in the sky. That link ensures long-term continuity. As dynasties change and cities rise and fall, the fixed stars anchor the ritual structure. Here the path stretches forward, and a city inherits an alignment even if its original meaning fades. That is how a very old sky model survives inside a new political map. Accuracy demands an explanation for how such knowledge appears without a sequence of novice mistakes. One answer is transmission. Skilled groups maintain secrets across generations. They teach star names, rising times, and ritual timings as part of initiation, not in public texts. Those apprentices then lay out new buildings with old principles. If a flood destroyed archives, the geometry and the liturgy could carry the data until writing resumed. That mechanism can move sky knowledge through disaster. A second explanation is redundancy. Many cities align their sacred districts. When several independent lineages use overlapping calendars, errors average out. The result looks clean when recovered, even if each city made small corrections by eye. The fact that different river towns share month names and planetary associations hints at a network that cross-check the sky. Trade brings not only goods, but also timings for fairs, contracts, and tax periods. If everyone needs the same celestial schedule to settle accounts, the sky becomes a shared ledger. A third piece is the choice of cycles. Some cycles close neatly with small integers. Venus approaches an 8-year repeat. The moon's nodes swing back near an 18-year rhythm. The sun returns each year. Use these cycles as your framework, and your system gains resilience. You can store the pattern in memory, tools, and temples. If a city falls, another can reconstruct the calendar from the same cycles. This is part of why the earliest records show confidence. The cycles favour conservation of knowledge. This still leaves the issue of age. Why do some constellations and seasonal associations look older than the cities that record them? One path leads beneath the flood layers. The pre-flood strata contain structured communities with ritual features and sight lines that suggest basic sky engagement. If an older cultural zone tracked stars and handed down its schema orally or in symbolic art, then the Sumerian adoption would read as continuity, not invention. That fits what the temples tell us: reconstruction on old foundations guided by sky rules that predate the surviving archives. Another path follows the coast. Before sea levels rose, the Persian Gulf basin held rivers and fertile land. A maritime or estuarine culture could have kept sophisticated sky lore, using stars for navigation and timing. As waters advanced, survivors moved upstream, carrying calendars tied to horizons that no longer existed. Their children rebuilt cities with alignments that honoured a lost shoreline. The mismatch between orientation and local sunrise angles would then reflect fidelity to an older reference frame. City planners were restoring a remembered template rather than optimizing for a new latitude. There is also the matter of selection. Not every star makes it into the canon. The ones that do are useful, bright, well-placed and reliable. If a culture curates its sky to include the most stable markers, those markers persist across centuries with minimal drift confusion. That conservatism can make a system look ancient because its core elements do not change. The appearance of deep time may be a product of careful choice. Yet the fit to older seasonal positions remains a signal that the choices were made when the sky wore a slightly different calendar jacket. Critics point out that later Babylonian astronomy is where the real mathematics appears, with tables and predictive schemes. True, but early Sumerian layers hold the operating system. The mathematics comes later as a formal description of a machine already in use. The clockwork existed in ritual cycles, building orientations and administrative calendars. When the math caught up, it was writing down a practice that had endured. All of this circles back to the tablet that lists impossibly long reigns. If a culture encodes its past in cycles, and if its temples enshrine sky knowledge, then numbers in a king list are not random theatrics. They are part of the same habit of storing long memory in repeatable patterns. The sky is the archive you cannot burn. A city can fall, a library can flood. But the sun still rises where it should. The moon keeps its appointments and Venus returns on schedule. Tie your history to that, and you can retrieve your story after the mud hardens. So when we say the Sumerians knew skies they should not have known, the claim is not that they built telescopes in secret. It is that their earlier surviving architecture, rituals and lists already carry the marks of a long apprenticeship under the heavens. The horizon lines, the month names, the star associations, the intercalation rules, and the fixed angles in brick. Together they form a record that points backward beyond the lifespan of the cities we can excavate. And if the record points backward, the next question follows in a straight line. Where did the first template of that sky come from? And how far did the memory travel to reach the hands that pressed it into clay? The story doesn't end with a single tablet in a museum case. It keeps rewriting itself every time the text gets copied, moved and fitted to a new throne. The King List didn't sit untouched. It travelled. Scribes carried it from Sumerian cities into Babylon and Assyria, reshaping its edges while keeping its spine. What began as a record that spanned the impossible and the ordinary became a tool that told rulers where they stood in a chain older than memory. That chain was the point. If kingship descended in the beginning, it had to keep descending onto the city that could claim it this season. The earliest versions tie rule to specific centres. One city holds power, then it passes to another after disaster or decision. Later, copies keep that rhythm but adjust the handoff points. The winners reorganise the timeline to show that power moved to them with cosmic approval. The method is quiet and careful. A line gets shortened, a city gets dropped, a reign absorbs another reign. The math still adds up for each section, but the pattern now points in a direction that favours the current dynasty. When Babylon rises, the line of succession bends toward Babylon. When Assyria surges, the chain tilts toward Assur and Nineveh. The text offers legitimacy through continuity, not conquest. Copying wasn't mechanical. Each scribe curated. Clay prisms and tablets carry minor discrepancies that accumulate into strategy. A city that fell out of favour could fade into fewer lines. A king whose cult needed elevation might receive a longer reign total or find his name paired with a storied ancestor. The seam between pre-flood and post-flood remains, but what happens after the flood becomes negotiable. The overarching trick is to keep the ancient scaffolding intact while recentering the spotlight without tearing the curtain. That trick is political memory disguised as chronology. In this editorial process, myth and history are not categories, they're raw materials. The scribes treat both with the same ledger logic. A mythical king can stabilise a dynasty by anchoring it to the deep past. A historical king can be trimmed to fit a larger arc. The tablets keep the pre-flood stretch untouchable, a kind of sacred prologue that no ruler dares edit. The elasticity shows up after cities reappear. From there, the record must pass through the city that pays the scribe. The point is not to fabricate events, it's to arrange inherited fragments so that the present looks inevitable. The way the list moves from city to city reads like a map drawn from memory. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, then the deluge, then Kish rises. Later, Nippur and access the script. Babylon and Assyria translate the same cadence into their own dialects of rule. You can see the editorial thumbprints in how kings are grouped, how some reigns cluster around a temple's rebuilding, and how gaps close whenever a city needs a clean link to an older seat of power. Each revision doesn't change the melody, it changes the key. This is where political theology merges with naming. Kingship isn't won, it descends. For a ruler who wants more than force, a genealogy that leaks backward into primordial time is an asset. The King List provides that tether. It names the cities that carried the mantle before you, so you can claim the mantle now. When an empire needs a story that spans the flood and the founding, the list offers a wire that stretches across the river, ready to be walked. The balance is delicate. Push too far and the line snaps. Keep the numbers, the transitions, the sacred cities, and the wire holds. Assyrian versions reveal another layer of editing. They expand on specific reigns tied to their heartland while keeping the framework intact, linking Nineveh and Assur as heirs rather than arrivals. Babylonian copies prefer routes that pass through Babylon's temples and ancient claims on cosmic order. Even small formula changes, phrases signalling that kingship was taken to a particular city, become political instruments. The wording turns geography into destiny. It implies that the gods, not armies, decided where the throne belonged. The text becomes the ritual that crowns the conqueror. Over time, the list absorbs regional histories like a river taking in tributaries. Local chronicles feed into the master sequence. City archives contribute regnal periods and temple reconstructions. The process raises a careful question. Where did the earliest arrangement come from? The one that everything else clings to? The persistent structure suggests a source older than any single city-state. A template consulted rather than invented by later editors. That template is hard to see directly, but its outline appears in the parts that all versions refuse to change. Those parts read like a foundation slab under a rebuilt house. Calling it the tablet beneath the tablet isn't poetry, it's a survival pattern. After a catastrophe, communities salvage reliable patterns, lists, counts, sequences. They reassemble authority by anchoring it to a remembered order of cities and names. When scribes in later centuries copy the King List, they're copying a memory device designed in the wreckage of a reset. Its first purpose might not have been a history at all, but a continuity protocol. Who holds the mantle after the waters, which shrines reopen, what sequence restores the calendar, where first fruits go, which names must be spoken to resume the year. That function explains the blend that feels so strange to modern readers. Mythic kings and later verifiable rulers live on the same line, because the point isn't ontology, it's operational memory. The list preserves the order that restarts the network: City A, then City B, then City C. The details of individual reigns are less important than the handoff itself. Edit the details for current needs. Keep the handoff intact. When a new empire rises, it inserts itself at the next node in a chain that no one risks severing. If the chain breaks, the year stops making sense. Crops fail on paper before they fail in the field. The material culture backs this habit. Temple archives show administrative tablets copied and recopied for centuries with updated headers, but with internal tables unchanged. Calendars get adjusted for new festivals while preserving core intercalations that keep seasons aligned. The King List mirrors that behaviour in political time rather than agricultural time. It intercalates dynasties. It reconciles the sky of legitimacy with the ground of power. Each revision is like adding a leap month to reconcile drift, but for thrones instead of moons, there's a cost. The sharper the political use, the more the early horizons fade into abstraction. Later rulers could point to an unbroken chain, but the texture of the oldest segments thinned. As the list served law codes, treaties, and royal inscriptions, it traded nuance for clarity. We get the shape, not the faces. Yet the numbers preserve a signal. Even when names change and sequences shift, the reign totals retain a strange discipline. They make later edits sit inside earlier math, forcing scribes to fit new claims into inherited patterns. That constraint is evidence of a template strict enough to bind ambition. The redaction continues into cultural translation. When empires export their authority, they export their timeline. Neighbouring regions adopt the structure while adapting names and deities, treating the chain of kings as a universal spine that can house local vertebrae. The list becomes a diplomatic language. It allows alliances to be framed as legitimate transfers of a cosmic office, rather than mere pacts. It also sets the stage for imperial theology to move from temple to law. If kingship originates outside human invention, then legal authority derives from maintenance of that continuity, not from popular will or personal force. This is why the King List matters beyond its shock value. It shows how states manufacture antiquity in real time. They don't forge the past, they tune it. They inherit a core record of transitions, then align their present to it while pruning rival lines. Every version still points to the flood as the fixed pivot, but every version also teaches future readers how to read the present as a legitimate aftermath. The text acts as a machine that converts victory into inheritance. The editorial fingerprints also point to an anxiety underneath the confidence. If the line of descent is that crucial, then disruption is terrifying. Rebellions and invasions don't just threaten borders, they threaten continuity. Redactors rush to plug gaps, connect ruptured sequences, and fold new rulers into the line fast. That urgency leaves traces, double entries, overlapping reigns, and sudden shifts in wording. Those glitches reveal the pressure of events on the clay. You can watch empires trying to keep the wire tight while the wind pulls at it. At a distance, this process turns the King List into a palimpsest of repairs, layered over a base map that no one was willing to discard. The redactions teach us how later states rid the past, as a resource to be curated, a precision instrument for stabilizing the present, and a shield against the accusation of novelty. Novelty is dangerous in a world that values dissent. Better to be the latest chapter in a very old book than the author of a new one that the gods haven't approved. If that's the habit, then the oldest version, the hidden template, becomes more than a curiosity. It looks like a recovery plan written by survivors who needed a working order to restart society. Cities respond to this plan across centuries, updating their place in the chain and tightening their claim to the mandate, which means every edit, every recentering, is a clue to how each empire understood its duty to the past and its fear of falling off the line. Follow that logic forward and a question forms naturally. If the list is a repaired bridge rebuilt after disaster, What earlier structure required such careful maintenance that even conquerors dared not replace it with something new? They climb into square holes cut into old river plains, trowels and brushes ready for crude huts and trial and error beginnings. Instead, they meet a silence made of clay. Under the neat grids of excavation tape, the soil splits into two worlds. Above, streets, tablets, drains, ovens, the normal record of cities. Below, a smooth swathe of sterile mud, and under that something that forces a double take, order where chaos should be. The expectation was scattered hearths and experimental farming. The ground offers deliberate plans, rebuilt platforms, and the kind of continuity that only comes from institutions. At Eridu, the trench walls read like a ledger. A thick, clean layer of flood-laid silt divides the scene. Beneath it, the oldest city steps forward in phases. Not camps, not random huts. A single sacred rise, rebuilt so many times the levels stack like a staircase into the past. Each rebuild reuses the footprint, keeps the axis, raises the platform a little higher, and refines the plan. Mud brick courses get tighter, plaster finishes grow more careful, floors show wear at the same thresholds across generations. That regularity tells you something simple and hard to ignore. People guarded a central idea through time. They remembered a way to arrange space, a way to face a doorway, a way to approach a room that mattered more than the building's age. You can see tools changing, materials sourcing widening, but the ritual core doesn't drift. The paradox grows as you follow the strata. A pre-flood shrine should hint at the invention of worship. Instead, it shows a routine. Burn layers collect in the same place. Ash lenses repeat at the same altar corners. Offerings pile in consistent caches. Access ramps align in repeated orientations, suggesting a remembered procession path. This isn't discovery, it's maintenance. The people down there knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it again and again on the same spot, as if the ground had its own script. Move northeast to Nippur, and the deep cuts narrow the view to right angles and planned corridors. The soil keeps the plan long after wood and reeds are gone. Foundations step in clean sequences, wall lines meet at deliberate junctions, and courtyard drains take runoff away from thresholds in the same direction across rebuilds. Builders select specific clays for bricks and change the mortar mix for damp zones, as if following a site manual. Smaller rooms cluster around controlled access spaces, setting a hierarchy you can read without inscriptions. Even in the darkest layers, the precinct breathes like a centre with rules. It is not a village swelling into complexity. It is complexity holding its footprint. At the trench profiles cut through that same quiet mud band and expose houses that don't look experimental at all. Excavators found rooms linked in rational sequences, with door pivots worn smooth from long use. The masonry binds with bitumen, a decision you make when you need strength and water resistance, and you already know where to source and how to heat and apply it. Courtyards manage light and airflow. Thresholds sit a step higher to keep water out. In the marsh zone beyond the walls, channels run straight and feed smaller laterals, a sign that someone mapped the flow, not guessed at it. Clay-lined basins hold the sheen of repeated use. The picture is problem-solving embedded in habit. Shuruppak adds yet another layer of order. Under the flood deposit lie homes with standard proportions, storage rooms with raised floors to keep grain dry, and firing areas where pottery production ran at a steady pace. Workyards show sorting zones for raw clay. Ovens line up by size and burn signature, hinting at batch control. Seal impressions appear on jar stoppers and clay tags. Simple devices, but they mean counted goods, controlled movement, and people responsible for them. When you find ceilings in trash pits, it's because someone tracked deliveries, stored items, and later discarded the record after use. That is administrative behaviour in the substrate before the flood separates eras. Across the sites, patterns repeat. Foundation trenches cut to consistent depths. Brick sizes lock into ratios that let crews swap units between walls without recalculating. Drainage aligns with slope in ways that demand survey knowledge, however simple the tools. Hearths sit away from storage, a choice that protects grain and fuel. Ceramic styles lateral across distance show the same firing temperatures and slip recipes. Rope impressions match across regions, suggesting shared standards for cordage used in measuring, packing and transport. You start to see a web, not a set of isolated experiments. Trade routes show up as non-local stone arrives in places without quarries. Bitumen travelled, so did obsidian, so did ideas. The more you list the details, the more the collective pattern pushes back against the origin story. These layers should read like early drafts. They read like a copy of a finished plan. Not a perfect copy, there are mistakes, fixes, rebuilds, but the baseline competence is not tentative. Temples keep to alignments across reconstructions. Dwellings keep proportions that work for privacy, air movement, and light. Workshops cluster near water and away from sacred areas. Circulation routes avoid high water points. These choices stack up into a civic logic. You can call it tradition or engineering, but either way it's consistent and it reaches across cities. Now look again at the mud band itself. It doesn't carry the debris of normal life. It carries volume. It covers and seals. Above it we get writing, tall platforms, processional roads, and the full administrative apparatus. The surprise is not that civilization appears above. It's that the verses underneath hum with a tune the later cities already know. The gap reads like a pause, not a birth. This is where the twist lands. The underworld of the trenches is too practiced to be chapter 1. The sequence at Eridu is a syllabus repeated, not a lecture discovered. Nippur's old precincts lay out a plan that later ages will only scale up. Ur's marsh solutions look like a mature response to conditions that do not change much over time. Shurupak's seals and storerooms do the mental work of a ledger without the characters. If you strip away the writing and the monumental scale, the core activities, water control, standard measurement, sacred hierarchy, production runs, stand complete. So the beginning we keep expecting retreats further back, into layers not yet found or lost to sea. Instead of a first attempt, what rises after the flood looks like a project restart. Crews return to the same nodes on the landscape. They rebuild where the old foundations hold. They reuse the ratios because those ratios flow through training, not chance. The flood silenced the text. It did not drain the muscle memory. As the soil dries and the new phase begins, the plan comes back fast because the plan never lived only in clay tablets. It lived in habits, repeated rituals, and a way of mapping space to meaning. That reframes the role of the early cities. Eridu, Nippur, and Shuruppak are not inventors of form, they are caretakers of a template. Their builders can reverse engineer a ritual from a footprint. They can restore a precinct from a pattern in the subsoil. They know that a temple needs height, that a court needs shade, that waste needs gradient, that storage needs airflow, and that goods need marks to move through hands without confusion. None of that requires an alphabet at first. All of it requires continuity. The flood band then becomes less a mark of chaos and more a hinge. Before it, we see institutions that can hold shape without text. After it, we see those institutions arm themselves with writing, numbers and formal bureaucracy, as if someone decided to box the memory so the next hinge would not eat it. The same minds that lifted brick on brick beneath the mud now record the bricks, count the jars, time the festivals, list the kings, and chart the sky. But the ground says the blueprint lived earlier. This is why the excavations unsettle the neat story of emergence. Every time a trench cuts down and meets that flat layer and goes through it, the eye learns that order doesn't start on page 1 of the script we can read. Order survives. It leaves tracks in foundations and habits and floorware. It leaves shared proportions across distance. It leaves drain lines pointed where gravity says they should, and it leaves platforms facing the same side of the horizon through rebuilds and centuries. The middle chapters under the mud ask a direct question about missing pages. If this is the level of organisation that precedes writing, What stood before the flood to teach consistency that long? Oral training alone can do a lot. Apprentice systems can carry trade secrets. Ritual can preserve alignments and protocols. But the scale across sites hints at networks older than the mud band. People were already talking across rivers and gulf inlets, carrying bricks ratios, seal motifs, and temple sequences the way a guild carries its methods. Read that implication back into the story of the cities above the mud. Their speed is no longer mysterious. They are not inventing administration from scratch. They are formalizing it. They are not discovering the calendar by trial, they are standardizing it. They are not groping towards sacred geography, they are rebuilding it at scale. The flood erased surfaces, not memory, which takes us to the threshold of older thought. If the ground beneath the flood already holds coordinated shrines, planned precincts, and neighbourhoods that solve water and storage with quiet competence, then the ancients claim that kingship came from beyond, down the river, down from the sky, down from an earlier seat of order, lands differently. They were not explaining magic, they were pointing at a source. And the next step in their own story is to tell us what they believed stood before even that buried world, and who carried its patterns forward when the silt was still wet. What if the stories we call myths were entries from a ledger, trimmed, compressed, and retold until the dates fell off but the structure stayed intact? The Sumerians wrote about a world before the water rose, and they wrote as if they were reporting, not speculating. The language is spare. Institutions exist. Roles are defined. Knowledge has categories. The narrative acts like memory under stress, short, efficient, and concerned with keeping the right details intact. And when the soil gives up older foundations beneath the flood sediments, those texts stop sounding like fantasy and start sounding like transmission. In the tablets that sketch the world before the flood, creation isn't a messy origin tale. It's a registry of cities, offices, and domains. There are named centres with specific functions, where ritual and governance work together. Temples control stores, people track grain and labour, and the calendar links earthly time to a sky that is already organised. The gods aren't distant, they preside over institutions. Kingship is a role with protocols, not a hero's prize. The tone is administrative. The pre-flood world reads like a working system, not a campfire story about chaos slowly tamed. The places listed in those texts pull an odd trick. They show up on both sides of the floodline. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shuruppak. Names carved into clay also sit on real ground with stratigraphy that divides the before and after. Below the sterile mud, archaeology finds dense occupation layers with planned layouts, curated materials and standard building choices. Above it, you see the surge of urban life we call Sumer. The unsettling part is not that those cities exist. It's that the old names and the flood horizon line up. Paper memory and soil profile looking at each other across a layer of clay. Then there are the Apkallu. The tablets place 7 sages in the pre-flood period, not as kings and not as gods in the full sense, but as beings tasked with teaching. Their portfolio looks technical. They maintain ritual timing, they codify crafts, they shape temple architecture, they pass on the use of signs, they anchor agricultural practice and the observation of the sky. Their actions don't read like mythic spectacle, they read like curriculum, and that tone lines up with what appears above the flood, writing tied to accountancy, temples as management hubs, building plans that repeat rules rather than chase novelty. Descriptions of these teachers tend to dwell on methods and outcomes. They establish toolkits, they standardize measures, they order altars and processions, they tune the calendar to a sky that behaves with regular cycles. When you hold that against the sudden coherence of the post-flood city, orthogonal rooms, controlled storage, canal schedules and ceilings for goods, the match in mindset is hard to miss. The sages sound like the personification of a knowledge transfer that skips the awkward phases of invention and goes straight to implementation. Two narratives frame the flood as a discontinuity that doesn't destroy everything because procedure survives. In these accounts, humans live with institutions, kingship exists, and temples run as the anchor of public life. Records matter, lists matter, instruction matters. The flood breaks the line, but the line is not lost because a package of essentials is preserved and then reopened. What emerges after the water is not blind trial and error, it is resumption. This view aligns with a pre-flood horizon that shows steady technical competence without a visible birth scene for city life. The texts focus on continuity, not origin, and that matches the ground. The logic of the Mesopotamian flood is not framed as moral correction in the way later retellings prefer. It functions more like a noise cutoff. The decision to wipe the slate is administrative, the counter-move is technical. A guardian of the deep makes sure that the knowledge with public value, how to build, how to count, how to schedule the year, stays dry. The emphasis falls on storage and retrieval, not miracle. It's a world where power is cosmic, but the rescue plan runs through lists, plans and rules. If you've ever seen an archive box pulled from a basement after a crisis and used to restart an office, the attitude will feel familiar. This is also how oral transmission behaves when it has to carry fragile technical content over a break. Stories compress, characters become vessels. You turn a set of instructions into a person who never forgets, then you follow him through the narrative. Generations pass the bundle forward by repeating the deeds of the figure who brought the craft. If you map that onto temple schools that re-emerge with complete scribal games and numerical habits already intact, the device makes sense. Myth keeps the memory alive by tying it to a character, while the specifics are preserved by drills, lists and fixed forms. And you see this pattern beyond Mesopotamia. Other traditions talk about waters, resets, and civilizers who carry seeds, tools, or calendars. In India, cycles pivot on floods and restorations. In Mesoamerica, worlds end and begin with count corrections and sky order. In Greece, old deluges erase and partial memories return. The texture differs, but the function repeats. A past world stops. A few things are carried through. A new world resumes with a kit that looks inherited. If we strip the drama, what remains is a model for preserving social technology across a break. Keep the calendar, keep the measures, keep the plan of a city. Back in Mesopotamia, the pre-flood corpus reads as if someone cared less about origins and more about ensuring that critical systems reappear after an interruption. Kingship is not earned, it is received. Ritual timing is not improvised, it is maintained. Architecture is not experimental, it follows templates. Writing arrives in use cases, not poems. Agriculture is not a gamble, it is scheduled water and seed. And the Apkallu act less like magicians and more like standard bearers who guarantee that the handoff works. Archaeology complicates the picture by showing competence in the layers beneath the flood. That undercuts the notion that post-flood brilliance springs from nowhere. It suggests that the pre-flood system already held many parts of the later city. The gap is the erasure event. The response is the reassembly. The stories locate that response in a handful of figures and a few named cities that carry the burden of memory. The ground, for its part, gives us prepared platforms, ritual sequences and technical habits that read like rehearsal for the urban explosion above. When the texts list cities before the flood, they are not content with names, they assign roles. A place isn't only a map point, it is a function. Metalworking, animal husbandry, rites, keeping of time. This functional geography resembles the later world where cities specialise and coordinate. That is an odd thing for a myth to fixate on if it grew in a world without such coordination. It makes more sense as the residue of lived experience, a network that once existed mapped onto the story so that the network can be rebuilt when the water goes down. The sages also touch the sky, and not with thunderbolts. They align temples, they watch intervals, they bind calendars to cycles. The packets they pass on look like the kinds of rules that tie seasons and ritual together so that irrigation, harvest and bookkeeping keep the same beat. Post-flood sites that align structures to cardinal directions and track the passage of time in fixed units feel like the outcome of that teaching, practical astronomy as the backbone of social order. If we take the flood as a break rather than a blank, these stories tell us how a complex system prepares to survive. It hardens its knowledge into routines. It encodes schedules in architecture. It embeds memory into ritual. It trains specialists who memorize sequences. It writes key items into durable media when possible, and into oral machines, chants, lists, genealogies when not. When the break ends, those machines can rehydrate the system. That is how a city can arrive already knowing. So the pre-flood world, as described by the people who lived in the aftermath, looks strangely modern in its concerns. It focuses on logistics, timing and legitimacy. It treats authority as something that must be installed, not discovered. It cares about keeping practices exact across generations. It treats the sky as a clock and the temple as a server. And in that frame, the flood is not a moral thunderclap. It is a system failure. The reset plan depends on redundancy and error correction. The Apkallu are the redundancy. This lens also explains why so many cultures keep flood memories while disagreeing about names and motives. Catastrophes fracture lines of knowledge. Survivors carry fragments. Over time, they package those fragments in stories that make them easy to remember. The content drifts, but the structure remains. Civilizers appear because they embody the act of recovering techniques. Cities are named because urban life depends on specialized roles. The sky is central because reliable cycles tie communal life together when everything else is unstable. If we accept that the ancients may have been trying to communicate a recovery protocol more than a cosmogony, then the flood becomes both literal and procedural in their world. Rivers can drown plains, sea levels can erase coasts, storms can bury fields in clay. But the cultural flood is the loss of order. What matters is restarting the clock and reinstalling the rule set. That is what the tablets narrate with economy. Who brought what back, where, and under whose authority. The cumulative effect is simple and uncomfortable. The texts and the ground both argue for an organised world before the layers of sterile mud. The tablet tradition packages that world into learnable units. The sites show the after-action, rapid reappearance of complex planning, consistent alignment, and institutional continuity. Put together, they whisper that myth was a storage system, not an origin story. Which leaves the question the soil keeps asking and the stories keep circling. If a working civilization stood there before the water, and if its memory passed through teachers, lists, and ritual, what force was large enough to end that world so cleanly that only a compressed archive remained to rebuild from? What kind of force can wipe out an entire world so cleanly that it leaves only memory behind? That question hangs over every trench where the soil flips from lived-in earth to sterile clay. It's not an abstraction. It's a physical line you can touch, a boundary that says life was happening here until it wasn't. So we start with what requires no leaps. The Tigris and Euphrates are volatile. Their channels wander. Snowmelt from distant mountains and seasonal storms can turn them into fast, unpredictable engines. In a late Holocene landscape with shifting watercourses and low-lying floodplains, a river system like that can stack meters of silt in a single season. Cities built in braided river deltas are strong until they are not. Add meltwater from regional glaciers, a storm surge up the Gulf, or a channel of Vulcan that shunts a whole river into a city's edge, and you have enough energy to bury neighbourhoods and farms under clay, not over centuries, over days. That explanation fits a lot of the evidence. At sites associated with the last quiet chapters before Sumer's rise, excavation teams meet a ribbon of riverborne silt between human floors. The material shows quick deposition by water. radiocarbon dates cluster around the late 3rd millennium BCE. Some places record clean abandonment and later reoccupation, as if people returned only after the water retreated and the ground settled. That timing sits near the end of the pre-flood segment in the King List, and the kind of sediment you'd expect from a swollen river matches what gets pulled from the pits. This version doesn't require a global ocean boiling over. It requires a river doing what rivers do when climate and topography set the stage. But the neat answer doesn't land perfectly. The flood layers look broad and remarkably uniform across multiple sites spread over tens and hundreds of kilometres. A simple breach at a single levee does not explain wide, even sheets of clay showing up in cities that did not share the same local embankments. Uniformity means a large-scale event, or a sequence of events close enough together that the ground reads them as one stroke. The thickness in some places reaches meters, which hints at more than a bad flood season. It implies hydrology that operated at basin scale, not neighbourhood scale. So we widen the lens. Ancient Mesopotamia sat in a world still adjusting to a transformed coastline. As the last ice age ended, global sea levels rose in pulses. One of those pulses lifted seas rapidly, reshaping shores and drowning river valleys. Though that jump happened millennia before Sumer's cities, its effects persisted. The Gulf shoreline crept inland over time. The base level for the rivers changed. Marshes expanded, deltas migrated, and the river's gradients and flood behaviours shifted. A system with new geometry behaves in new ways, and for generations that can mean recurring instability. In a region that depends on canal networks and precise water levels to grow food, hydrological volatility is social volatility. Systems break not because people lack skill, but because the ground beneath their plans keeps changing. There's also the way human memory behaves under stress. Catastrophes spread across centuries compress into a single tale. Oral traditions aren't minute books, they're containers that preserve the shape of experience. If a valley floods badly 3 times in 500 years, and each time the survivors rebuild and relearn, later tellers will braid those shocks into one clean arc. There was a time before, a great water came, and we resumed. The archaeological record can register multiple layers, but the mind prefers a single hinge. This is how floods become the flood without requiring a single day when the whole world drowned. Still, we hear about catastrophes that reach beyond regional rivers. Some researchers point to a much earlier shock near the end of the Pleistocene. They argue that debris from a broken comet struck or exploded over parts of the northern hemisphere about 12,800 years ago. They present materials that form under extreme heat, like melt glass and certain nanostructures, and link them to sudden cooling and broad ecological stress. The idea remains debated, with specialists disputing the origins and context of the evidence, but it won't go away. If a real impact event punctured climate stability and forced rapid adjustments, it would have changed coastlines, weather patterns, and settlement options for thousands of years. The memory of a skyborne disaster would fold easily into a cultural story about a sudden reset, even if the actual floods remembered in Mesopotamia happened much later. Closer to the period of early cities, we can track climate jolts that cut hard and fast. Droughts can undo irrigation economies in a single generation. Monsoon shifts can reroute moisture from one basin to another, starving fields while salt creeps into soils. The 4.2 kiloyear event, centuries after the period we're focused on, shows how a complex state can falter under a few bad decades of drought. The precedent matters. It proves that environment, not invaders, can pull empires apart. If later societies shattered under climate stress, earlier ones could too. And in a delta plain, one era's drought can transform into the next era's catastrophic flood when rare rains finally come and the parched earth can't absorb them. That whiplash produces scars that look like sudden endings. Another clue sits off the map most people imagine when they think of ancient Iraq. During prehistory, the Persian Gulf was not a gulf. It was a wide river valley hosting wetlands, lakes, and fertile plains. Only within the last 10,000 years did the sea fill that basin. People living on that drowned landscape would have occupied levees, fished in lagoons, irrigated low fields and travelled long canals. As water advanced, they moved upslope, carrying practices with them. If any communities there developed complex lifeways, their ruins now sit under the seafloor. In that case, the flood memory would come from a real displacement and inundation that erased settlements without leaving accessible ruins. When later groups settled along the new shoreline and up the rivers, their grandparents' stories about land turned to sea would merge with the river surges they themselves survived. The combined narrative would carry the weight of truth. There was a world here. Water took it. Taken together, the river mechanics, the basin-wide hydrology, the inherited instability from earlier sea level changes, and the behaviour of memory can explain why a single, precise sediment line feels like the edge of an era. For the people who lived through it, the flood did not need to be global. It needed to be total for them. If your granaries vanish, your records disintegrate, your fields salt over, and your temple mound becomes an island in a brown sea, your world has ended. Archaeology supports exactly that kind of ending. Excavations show practical halts, followed by reoccupation with adjustments, new canal alignments, different building materials, modified layouts that reduce exposure to water, and a renewed emphasis on preserving specialised knowledge. That last part matters. When a society resets, it triages memory. It chooses what it can't afford to relearn the hard way. Irrigation algorithms, planting calendars tied to stars, surveying methods, fraction systems for rations. Those survive first. They also store well in numbers. Numbers travel better than myths because they compress. You can embed timing rules and celestial cycles into rain lengths and ritual counts, and they won't drift the way a long story does. If a real catastrophe ended the world under Sumer's feet, then the strange totals in the King List begin to look like memory devices built to outlast chaos. So the force that erased that earlier world doesn't have to be a single monster wave. It can be a sequence of river megafloods cued by climate shifts, riding on top of a landscape still settling from the end of the Ice Age, with echoes of older shocks feeding a culture-wide conviction that resets are real and cyclical. Sediments around 2900 BCE line up with this reading. The deposits are too consistent across space to dismiss as a local levee failure, yet they don't require oceans to cross continents. They require a vulnerable plain, stressed rivers, and a few bad years that become the reference point for centuries. When a region carries that kind of scar, it starts to measure time differently. Eras become chapters between waters. Leadership becomes a duty that arrives from the outside of normal life, because normal life has proven fragile. Numbers stop being only counts. They become containers, packing methods for saving astronomy, calendars, and statecraft. That's why reigns can stretch to impossible spans on a tablet, while still holding a kind of truth. They may be the math of survival, not the biology of kings. Push that idea forward and the floodline under Mesopotamia looks less like an accident and more like a hinge. It closes one system and opens another, with people rebuilding from the fragments that held up best underwater, the numerical skeleton of the old world. Which is why, when the King List steps from legends into rulers we can verify, it does not bother to erect a fence. It treats both halves as one continuum. Under a sky that can change the rules without warning, continuity lives wherever you can store it. And if the flood was real in that very local, very final way, then those impossible rains and tidy totals stop reading as exaggerations. They start reading as coded cycles, as counts of remembered ages bound to celestial rhythms. The next step is to test the numbers the way you'd test a calendar, salvage from a ruined library and see if the cycles inside them still keep time. We left the ground and stepped into arithmetic, where memory can survive as a sequence of clean numbers. The pre-flood section of the King List sets a total of 241,200 years across 8 rulers, a figure that sounds absurd until you treat it like a code. In Mesopotamian counting, the Sa is 3,600, the Nur is 600, the Sos is 60. Those aren't guesswork, they're base 60 units written into administrative practice. When you break the reins down, many resolve into exact stacks of Sas and Nirs. This is not the loose exaggeration you get from fireside storytelling. It reads like a ledger entry. Integers, tidy intervals, recurring factors, and totals that compress into low prime structures under base 60 arithmetic. The question stops being, how could anyone live that long? And becomes, what did those numbers hold that mattered enough to keep precise? The idea that myth carries numbers is not unique to Mesopotamia. It repeats across regions and eras. Egyptian priests tracked time overnight by decans, star groups rising on a 36-fold schedule that structured both calendars and temple rites. Indian texts lay out the Yuga system, nested time spans that build a long chronology from repeating cycles. The classic Maya used katuns and baktuns to encode historical events inside a rolling count that links dynastic politics to an astronomical framework. In each case, the mythic shell wraps a technical core, a stable numerical system that stores period lengths, aligns ritual with sky, and passes both through generations even when script, language, and sovereignty change. This is a human pattern. Abstract data hides inside stories because stories travel. Look closely at the pre-flood rains and the discipline stands out. The durations cluster around multiples of 3,600, with rains like 28,800 or 36,000 that compress to 8 or 10 Sars with no remainder. Others resolve to mixed Sar plus Ner packages that still sum cleanly under sexagesimal arithmetic. There's a visible preference for round stacks. No odd leftovers, no awkward fractions. If this were simple boasting, you would expect a scatter of tall claims without structure. But the numbers behave like the outputs of a system that cares about divisibility in standard units. That is exactly what a bureaucracy cares about. You can call it myth, but the math is administrative in temperament. One camp of scholars leans on what you might call the symbolic age theory. In that reading, absurdly long reigns signal transcendence, moral superiority, or cosmic endorsement. The numbers are not meant to be read, they're meant to be felt. A king who rules for 36,000 years rules metaphorically forever. It sets him in a class different from the mortal kings that follow. This view treats the king list as literary theology welded to political memory. It makes sense of the way divinity and sovereignty interlock in Mesopotamian thought, and it fits how later editors use the text to legitimize dynasties. Another camp tests the cycle encoding theory. Here, rain totals are not blank metaphors but calendars embedded in narrative. Precession alters the background of the sky by roughly 1 degree every 72 years, producing long cycles close to 2,160 years per zodiacal sign, and about 25,920 years for a full circuit. Eclipse cycles like the Saros run about 18 years 11 days. Bundles of Saros cycles produce longer eclipse patterns across centuries. Venus has an 8-year synodic pattern that locks to solar years neatly in base 60. When analysts map certain rain totals and clusters against these cycles, intriguing alignments show up, especially when they convert the sexagesimal packages into period counts. The claim isn't that every number maps cleanly to the heavens, it's that the statistical density of neat, repeating units fits a world where priest astronomers stored sky rules inside royal durations. Then there's the deep time dynasty model. In this view, the pre-flood kings are not individuals but houses, titles, or ritual offices that spanned generations. A name stands for a coherent line with consistent functions and symbols, and the long count describes the tenure of the line, not a single lifespan. This is how later Near Eastern lists sometimes compress reality. One eponym or archetype stands in for a sequence. The model gains weight from the way kingship passes between cities in the text, as if sovereignty itself relocates on a schedule rather than simply being seized. Extended reigns would mark long periods when a single centre governed the ritual calendar, economy, and flood control for a region. Under that frame, the numbers stop being body counts and become institutional durations. These models compete, but they share a premise. The numbers are too neat to be random. Sumerian scribes were careful. They balanced accounts by grain type and capacity measure. They tracked fields, labour, and rations with consistency that still jumps off clay tablets today. It's difficult to imagine that the same culture would then toss arbitrary exaggerations into the most important political chronology and leave them in clean multiples of 60 by coincidence. Even the transitions between reigns often fall on tidy sums that are easy to recite and memorise. Another sign we're looking at a constructed matrix, not an accident of tradition. If you step back, a pattern emerges that threads the numbers to geography. The King List says kingship was in a city, then went to another. Read as cycles, each location holds authority for a span that sorts into Sars and Nirs. Eridu's tenure sits at the beginning, followed by Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak, names that correlate to real sites known for early sacred zones, craft activity or administrative layouts. The long durations could reflect periods when a city's temple controlled the water regime and ritual calendar for its basin, passing the role after a major flood, canal reorganisation, or cultural shift. In a land where rivers move and silt builds, control of water equals control of time. A hydrological cycle and a political cycle might share a single count. You can also read the sexagesmal packaging as an insurance policy against loss. If a culture expects catastrophe, numbers in base 60 have an advantage. They break cleanly into many factors: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. That makes them easy to reassemble from partial knowledge after disruption. A priesthood that needs to restore calendars and rituals from fragments can recover a working system by recognising a few anchors. A reign length of 36,000 told as 10 Sars preserves not just magnitude but structure. It tells you what units matter and how to rebuild them. It's a mnemonic kit designed for return. This isn't special pleading for a pet theory. It follows from how ancient technical knowledge moves when writing is fragile and archives drown. You encode the most vital schedules in the safest containers. You teach through meter, number and ritual. You attach the counts to names people adore or fear so that they repeat them without forgetting. Egyptian deacons hung on nightly rites, Indian yugas attached to cosmic order, Maya khatuns ride alongside royal propaganda, Mesopotamian reigns live inside a list that every new ruler must acknowledge. The wrapper changes, the counts persist. The tension grows because each model answers part of the riddle but not the whole thing. The symbolic age theory explains the theological tone, but cannot account for the strict arithmetic. The cycle encoding theory fits the math, but needs a mechanism linking priestly astronomy to royal propaganda across centuries. The deep time dynasty model resolves the lifespan problem, yet depends on evidence for multi-generational title continuity embedded in a pre-flood period we cannot excavate in full, and still, the base 60 neatness won't let go. You always come back to the integers. An expanded view suggests the pre-flood numbers outline eras, not years lived. Each king marks a sustained arrangement of power, water, trade, and ritual, each anchored to a city that serves as an axis for a network. The durations stacked in Sars preserve the periodicity of these arrangements. When rivers change course or silt chokes canals, the axis shifts to a new city. The King List remembers that motion as a transfer of kingship. It reads as a political theology on the surface, but underneath it's a chronology of environmental management and institutional memory. If that's true, the list becomes a tool for post-catastrophe governance. A new dynasty, stepping into a landscape complicated by fresh deposits of mud and lost boundaries, would need a calendar, a schedule for offerings, a plan for canal maintenance, and a story that tells everyone why this city is now in charge. A text that bundles all of this into cycles tied to revered names meets that need with elegance. It's a constitution encoded as legend and count. Call it a mnemonic device rather than a linear timeline. The pre-flood section compresses a long, irregular prehistory into an ordered sequence that survives copying and political editing because it remains useful. Later, kings can adjust totals, argue over which city deserves primacy, or insert their house into the chain. But the core survives, the sexagesimal scaffold, and the idea that authority moves in cycles linked to sacred centres and measurable periods. That is a kind of memory robust against flood, regime change, and linguistic drift. Once you accept cycles at the root of the numbers, the broader implication follows. If the rains measure eras, and those eras reflect recoveries and resets, then civilization itself may be cyclic. It rises to a coherent system, suffers a break and regathers around the next stable node. The King List does not claim novelty for each beginning, it implies return. The numbers teach the rhythm you need to return on time, which leads to a quieter point. We still live on a clock built on SOSS, near and SAR logic. Our hours, minutes and degrees are the debris of a base 60 world. If the pre-flood rains store the cadence of older cycles, then that same cadence flows through our daily schedules without our noticing. The list would then be less a myth about impossible kings, and more a map of how to reassemble a world after water has erased the lines. And once you see the cycles in its math, you start to expect cycles everywhere else, especially in the story of how cities die and return. Civilization doesn't bloom out of trial and error here, it reassembles. After the flood layers, cities appear with street grids, monumental platforms, and administrative systems that behave like restorations rather than prototypes. The pattern repeats from Eridu to Uruk, temples laid out on orientations that align with cardinal directions, precincts separated for cult, storage and craft, and streets scaled to cart traffic, as if the dimensions came from a handbook few had to debate. When a world restarts with standard answers, it points to memory, not invention. The earliest urban cores in southern Mesopotamia carry this imprint. Uruk's Iana district arrives with specialised buildings serving different functions, ritual, storage, processing, tied together through pathways that optimise flow. The architecture keeps recurring proportions. Brick sizes standardise across phases. That kind of uniformity suggests training, curriculum and templates. These are not experiments scattered across villages. They are procedures executed by teams that already speak the same technical language. Writing follows the same arc. The first tablets are not myths or poetry. They track grain, labour rations, land allotments, livestock and shipments. Numeric signs anchor the system. Notations scale from small counts to large tallies with consistent rules. The existence of metrology tables so early tells us that measures were fixed, agreed upon, and taught. When you see barley signs tied to specific container symbols and surface weights, you're looking at continuity. Somebody remembered how it should work and taught it at scale. Irrigation is another inheritance. Canals cut across marsh margins with deliberate gradients. Spillways manage seasonal surges. Feeder ditches join main arteries at regular angles to control flow speed. Settlements sit on slightly raised platforms near canal junctions, a placement that balances flood risk and transport access. The engineering logic holds across sites. It uses clay, reed and bitumen in predictable ways. That kind of distributed skill doesn't arise from improvisation season by season. It's policy embedded as practice. The material kit that appears after the flood layers shows a similar standard. Pottery types meet functional niches, storage jars with long shoulders for cool evaporation, bowls standardised for ration measurement, spouted vessels for controlled pours. Clay ceilings carry administrative marks that follow recognisable sign families across regions. This gives us two clues: a shared symbolic order and shared enforcement. Sealed jars and doors tell you about inventory and access control. That's not a village habit, that's an institution. Calendrics and counted time slip in here as well. Ration cycles linked to lunations. Work teams mark tasks by predictable intervals that coordinate across sites. When temples and palaces allocate bread, beer and oil on rotating schedules, they rely on a system people recognise without dispute. You don't get that without prior consistency. In other words, the clock is already running when the cities appear. Even the way space is sanctified feels second nature. Temples sit on platforms not because higher is more impressive, but because higher is safer and more stable in a floodplain. The recurrence of raised terraces, stepped access and boundary walls shows physical memory at work. Foundational deposits beneath floors, small collections of beads, tools and tokens, turn up as if they continued a code, not invented one. Ritual reinforces engineering, and engineering stabilizes ritual. That feedback loop looks refined, not experimental. Art follows the same logic. Cylinder seals carve recurring motifs that encode status, function, and myth in an administrative medium. They capture process scenes, offerings, audience with officials, craft production. These aren't loose depictions, they're catalogues of how things should work. Even the music of the visual rhythm, rows, registers, repeated postures, suggests training. Craftspeople know what belongs where in the message. Trade links stretch out like old routes being reactivated. Materials converge on southern cities from known sources. Hard stones from the Iranian plateau, copper from the Gulf Arc, timber from the north, lapis from far east of Mesopotamia. The channels serve defined needs inside a redistribution system. This requires trust structures, weights, seals, overseers that don't get built overnight. You see the scaffold of a network that remembers its own architecture. Law and authority settle into familiar paths. Decisions route through assembly spaces and overseers link to temple precincts. Records pile up in storerooms arranged by topic and time. The habit of filing is already there, along with the training to read the system. When a city can change officials without collapsing the process is old, not new. Education hides in the clay. Scribes practice sign lists and sequences standardized across schools. They copy model texts that teach format and form before content. The earliest exercises already know what a correct tablet should look like. That means the template existed earlier, even if the surviving schools belong to the city above the flood layers. A curriculum implies continuity of teachers. The chain survived. Urban layout shows deliberation that suggests comparative planning. Sacred, administrative, and residential zones stand apart but interlock. Workshops hug canal edges for water and transport. Food processing sits near storage courts for efficient movement. Waste flows to low margins. When a plan integrates across multiple needs, someone has mapped the dependencies before ground is broken. The scheme doesn't grope, it applies. Agriculture works like a coordinated machine. Fields subdivide into patchworks aligned with channels and levees. Boundaries follow lines that are easy to maintain and easy to survey. Tools suit the ecology. Adze for silt soils, reed mats for bunds, bitumen for seams. Storage granaries stand at predictable distances from docks, which tells you how labour rhythms and transport cycles mesh. The system looks designed to withstand failure and keep feeding the core. Architecture scales up without losing the grammar. As cities grow, the same building modules stretch into complexes. Courtyards stitch rooms into circulation loops that support privacy, cooling, and work. Brick stamp marks tie production to central oversight, so builders follow recipes rather than improvisations. When you inspect a wall, you can read the bureaucracy in it. Even as war and defence enter the record, construction keeps the ritual engineering sync. Walls follow terrain and water in ways that conserve labour, suggesting prior mapping. Gates line up with transport flows and ration warehouses. Garrison spaces double as storage and administration. The city is a machine for survival that reuses every component. The religious vocabulary harmonizes with management. Offerings are totals, measured and logged. Sacrifice follows calendar slots that stabilize labor and morale. Processions map the city, reaffirming boundaries and authority. If you catalogue the ritual cycle, you get a civic operating manual. What emerges is not novelty but recall. The early Sumerian toolkit contains pre-solved problems packaged in durable forms: metrology, accounting, calendrics, irrigation, planning, literacy training. If a society with fresh ground under their feet shows this degree of order, they carried the pattern in their heads and hands. The flood covered the surface, but it didn't erase the blueprint. That changes how we read origin myths. Descending knowledge sounds less like a miracle and more like a relay. A class of specialists preserved techniques through crisis, then redeployed them when conditions allowed. Cities look like staging grounds for recovery, not experimental labs. The speed makes sense when you treat memory as infrastructure. So the question shifts. Not how did they invent all this so fast, but where did the template live while the land reset? And why the rebuilt world keeps pointing back to names and places that belong to the age beneath the mud, as if the new cities were simply the next draft of an instruction manual that refused to die. You glance at your phone and note the time without thinking. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours turning a day. The numbers feel ordinary, but they are not. You're moving through a numerical grid laid down by people who pressed signs into wet clay, planned canals in marshlands, and counted the sky in intervals of 60 long before steel clocks and satellites. The system governing your clock face is not modern, it's Sumerian, and it still works because it was designed to measure both the earth and the heavens with clean divisions that scale. Follow your map's turn-by-turn directions and the display pivots through a circle cut into 360 degrees. That circle didn't arise from medieval mathematicians or 19th century surveyors. The division fits neatly with a base 60 framework that breaks into halves, thirds, quarters, and sixths with ease, a silent advantage in navigation and geometry. The calendar on your wall sits on a 12-month frame. You don't need to believe in ancient star gods to see why a culture that tracked lunar cycles and agricultural seasons would stabilize time around 12. What matters is that the scaffolding survived. We operate on a scheme built to serve temples, fields, and the sky at once. This is where it gets uncomfortable. These aren't isolated inventions that happen to stick. They look like a toolkit recovered and redeployed after interruption. If the earliest writing shows up already handling accounts, rations, measures, and names, then the system that trained it existed first in practice. The tablets that survive look like ledgers, property tallies, and grain allocations, not origin myths. Bureaucracy comes first because it preserves memory, and the habits of that paperwork, seals marking authority, standardized measures, receipt copies, still organize modern institutions. Swap the clay for a database, and the logic doesn't change. Walk a city and the plan still whispers the old order. A raised precinct holds the sacred or the administrative core. Across an axis run storage yards, workshops and courts. Residential blocks spread along streets that conform to drainage and wind. Agricultural tracts anchor the edges, tied to water systems that feed them. You'll find this spine repeated from the Nile to the Tiber to medieval market towns. It persists because it solves problems of control, ritual, and supply in one coherent layout. The blueprint fits human needs that don't shift much. Now shift to political language. In the King List, authority arrives from above. It does not arise from the crowd. That phrasing didn't stop with Sumer. It hardens into theories of divinely sanctioned rule, oaths sworn by heavenly witnesses, and later, secular states that still use inherited symbols of cosmic order, eagles, stars, scales, rays of light, to legitimize their right to organize society. Strip the theology and the frame stays. Power must anchor itself to something older and larger than individual will. People obey calendars and clocks because they feel bigger than law. That's the point. Modern science circles back to cycles. We track Milankovitch rhythms, solar variability, ocean oscillations, and abrupt climate shifts that flip conditions across regions in decades. We document collapses that align with drought clusters, dust outputs, and river course changes. We live with a model of time that looks less like a staircase and more like a wheel. In that context, a record that compresses ages into reign totals and ties order to cosmology feels less odd. You don't have to accept myths to see the symmetry. The past talks in cycles because nature moves that way. Here's the harder thought. If Sumer lifted itself on the remains of an older pattern, and we laid our world on Sumer's grid, then we inherit a system once removed from its source. Some pieces drift over time, others calcify. Base 60 endures because it handles divisibility across trade and astronomy. City plans endure because water, food, and administration obey geography. Our legal and record-keeping habits endure because accountability requires durable forms, regardless of medium. Continuity is not nostalgic, it's functional. The earliest tablets that look like math exercises teach conversion between measures of grain, weight, and capacity. They train students to move cleanly across scales. Modern spreadsheets do the same thing with more digits. Ancient surveyors used chords and right angles to re-establish plots after floods. Engineers still re-establish baselines after disasters using grids and benchmarks. The through line is clear. Rebuilders prefer systems that can restart quickly. A base that breaks into many parts, a city plan that tolerates repairs, a calendar that reconciles lunar and solar rhythms. These are tools for recovery. Consider how institutions remember. A temple archive holds lists of offerings, names of officials, dates of festivals, and tallies of labour. A modern agency holds procurement records, payroll logs, meeting minutes, and regulatory codes. Both produce continuity during turnover or crisis. The form changes, the function doesn't. Writing emerges attached to accounting because counting stabilizes memory under stress. If a flood drowns a valley, the people who return need to know who owes what, which canal feeds which field, when to plant, when to collect. The system exists to restart order. Think about divided authority. The old model places sacred and administrative roles in close proximity, sometimes in tension. Today it's legislative, executive, judicial. The principle is separation and ritualization of power, so that decision-making looks repeatable and anchored. Ceremonies, insignia, and procedural language do what ancient rites did. Make the exercise of power predictable. The symbols shift across eras, but their work stays constant. Even our shared time ritual, work weeks, weekends, fiscal quarters, rests on calendars shaped by older cycles. 12 months. 7-day weeks linked to visible celestial objects and later religious practice. It's not that someone chose arbitrary numbers and tradition fossilized them. These were inherited compromises between social rhythm, religious observance, and agricultural necessity. They still moderate stress and coordinate behavior at scale. When we talk about collapse today, we use models that echo the old world view: thresholds, tipping points, feedbacks, and resets. Species die-offs, fires, droughts, storms, and migrations produce a sense of time that can jump. That's a lived experience of cyclicality. If the King List reads like a memory scaffold that made sense after a disaster, then its pattern matters now for practical reasons. A civilization that assumes continuity without storage and redundancy will fail the first test. One that stores knowledge in simple, divisible, restartable forms has a chance. So the familiar numbers on your phone are not quaint trivia. They are active components in a recovery architecture that never stopped running. They shape how planes navigate, how satellites time signals, how banks settle transactions, how classrooms teach geometry, how cities lay out roads, and how courts schedule terms. Through them, an old administrative astronomy still pulses under daily life. If continuity is the real achievement, then the King List turns from a curiosity into a guide. It points to systems that outlast rulers and floods because they encode balance between heaven's cycles and ground-level needs. And if the world moves in long arcs of rise and reset, the value of those systems increases not as relics, but as living tools, regular, divisible, and ready to start again the morning after the waters pulled back. They left numbers like traps. You can walk past them if you want, a list of reigns that stretch beyond human life, then shrug and call it myth. But the numbers keep pulling you back. They aren't random. They use clean base 60 arithmetic, tidy multiples, and recurring units that show discipline, not exaggeration. The Sumerians took care when they wrote, even when they were telling stories, and this list of kings, their sequence before the flood, behaves like a memory coded in math. So the question shifts, not did they believe it, but what were they preserving that way? If everything else could be washed away, numbers might be the one thing that endures unchanged. Start with what the reigns actually do. In the pre-flood sequence, each king rules for a number of years that lands exactly on the rails of sexagesimal counting. You see blocks of 3,600-year units, known later by scholars as SARs, repeated and stacked. The totals fold into each other as if they are measures of cycles, not lifetimes, years bundled into eras. Why wrap an age around a single royal name? Because a name travels through time better than a table of figures. A name can survive recitations copyists the wear on a tablet. A name is memory glue. There are three main ways people read this. First, the symbolic age reading. The reign lengths aren't durations, they're markers of stature. A colossal number sets a ruler apart, like a temple set on a high platform. Greatness becomes a count you can recite. This view explains the aura of the kings but leaves the precise arithmetic hanging. Myths tend to drift in their numbers over centuries. These do not drift. They stay stable across copies, which makes them behave less like poetry and more like bookkeeping disguised as legend. The second approach treats the numbers as an encoding of cycles. When you run the totals against known astronomical rhythms, certain matches stand out. Multiples of 3,600 years line up with long eclipse periodicities computed in sexagesimal, and with patterns you get when you track Venus over many cycles and fold it into base 60. Precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, is about 25,920 years for a full turn, and sexagesimal loves that sort of number. Divide, multiply, stack. The math plays well with round counts. This doesn't prove intent, but it raises an eyebrow. Why do reigns that should float in fantasy snap to numerical grids that mirror sky rhythms? The third reading is historical compression. A king's name stands in for a long house or dynasty. Think of it as a title that persists through many individuals, each inheriting the throne of an institution more than a person. The reign length becomes the time a city or a lineage dominates, not a single human life. When you read the list this way, the pre-flood sequence becomes a set of epochs, anchored to places that archaeology later exposes beneath flood sediments. Eras linked to Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. Dynastic time masquerading as personal time. Each model explains part of the puzzle. None cancels the others. In fact, they can stack. Symbolic status captures the mythic tone. Cycle encoding preserves astronomical knowledge through a durable number system. And dynastic compression anchors the story to real cities. A triple function makes sense if the goal is survival. After disaster, you store knowledge in overlapping forms so that at least one survives the next hit. Look at how the numbers behave at transitions. When kingship moves from one city to another, the reign units don't smear into untidy totals. They click into clean sums that feel like ledger entries closing and opening. This is how an accountant writes myth. Even the vocabulary, the idea of kingship as something that descends, arrives, departs, fits the mechanics of a system that treats power as a package, a standard, almost like a ritual artifact transferred between custodial centres. The math tracks the transfers like a shipment you can count. Now test the base 60 backbone. Sexagesimal loves factor-rich numbers. It divides evenly by many integers. If you want to embed periodic information, cycles of eclipses, synodic periods, long counts, you choose a base that doesn't require messy fractions. The earliest Mesopotamian number tablets show competence with place value and positional notation, flexible enough to handle big counts and tiny ration measures. So if you needed to carry forward a calendar architecture through chaos, you'd bind it to a narrative with names and cities and pack the actual math into the lengths of reigns. Reciters remember names, specialists extract the numbers. Pay attention to roundness. The reigns stack like you'd stack standard weights. They favour whole units that act like measures you can swap in and out of larger counts. This isn't how folklore inflates ages. Legendary lifespans tend to vary with storyteller mood, region and time. Yet across centuries of copying, Sumerian into Akkadian into Babylonian, the multiples hold their shape with small edits for politics, not arithmetic. That's odd if the numbers were only for awe. It's normal if they do a job. Where could this mathematical memory have come from? One answer: earlier people tracked the sky with patience, and the flood broke the chain. The survivors, or their successors, kept the system even if the origin story faded. Another answer: the math is a reconstruction, reverse engineered by priests and scribes who used observations from the new era to rebuild an older framework. In either case, embedding it in the king list reduces the risk of loss. You don't have to carry a separate technical manual through fire and water. The manual hides in the royal lineup everyone knows. Notice the way the pre-flood totals create a narrative rhythm. Long, stable blocks, city by city, then a termination, the flood, and short mortal reigns afterward. The shape itself teaches a lesson about time. Long cycles govern early ages, shorter cycles govern later ones. This matches a worldview where human time sits inside cosmic time. The kings become markers on a scale that reaches beyond bartographies. Their lengths tell you how far the big clock moved, not how long someone breathed. Some scholars resist reading too much into numerical neatness. Fair, coincidences happen. But we should also weigh the cultural profile. Mesopotamian scribes trained for exactness. They kept ration lists, loan records, land surveys, astronomical diaries. They were allergic to sloppy numbers. If a scribe gave a king an absurdly long reign, it likely served a purpose beyond spectacle. The precision itself is the clue. Now look at distribution. The pre-flood segment is heavy with large units. The post-flood segment drops into human-scale counts, but preserves a trace of the old system. You can think of this as a palimpsest, the old math showing through the new history. When later empires copied the list, they adjusted names and sequences to legitimize themselves, yet they left the core structure intact because it had legitimacy, older than any court. A king ruling now gains weight by sitting in a chair whose measurements match an ancient standard. Consider memory under stress. Oral cultures protect important data by locking it to rhythm, meter, and numerology. The king list is a written artifact, but it behaves like oral technology designed to endure. Numbers provide the meter, cities provide the rhyme. The flood is the caesura that breaks the stanza. Recitation becomes reconstruction, not entertainment. When the world recalibrates after upheaval, you use the preserved counts to rebuild calendars, rituals, and planting cycles aligned to the sky. That's practical, not romantic. What about the total? That staggering 241,200 years. Treat it as a headline figure encoding a grand period, a sum that can be split into known cycles by trained interpreters. Break it into base 60 factors, and you can extract nested periods that align with long-term observations. If precession, or other slow celestial motions were tracked in some way, this kind of big round number would hold the key to recalibrating after loss. You keep the recipe without the book. This framing also explains the list's stubborn city order. The sequence reads like epochs defined by centres of knowledge. Each city holds the standard for a time, then passes it on. If a disaster interrupts the chain, the next custodial centre uses the surviving numbers to restore the system. The king's name is a label on a box that contains the calendar, the rituals, the measures, the protocol, the me, in temple terms, bundled for transfer. A reign length written as a clean multiple signals the size of the package. There's a human angle here too. People need continuity after shock. A timeline that stretches back through the flood tells communities they are connected to an order larger than the latest ruin. A number that ties your festivals to the sky gives you a reason to rebuild the temple in the same alignment, on the same mound, with the same steps. The King List supplies that continuity with a spine of arithmetic, hidden in a story about kings. Later generations repeat the names and inherit the math whether they realise it or not. So, when we read those reigns as jokes or hyperbole, we may be missing the protocol. The long counts carry functions: keep time, track cycles, map authority, stabilise tradition. They also keep a record of loss. The jump from great blocks to human spans acknowledges a break. Something reset the clock. The precision on both sides admits that even after catastrophe, you can rebuild if you kept the numbers dry. If you accept that the lengths encode cycles, another door opens. Civilization becomes a pattern of recoveries. Each age remembers enough to restart the core systems: timekeeping, measurement, urban layout, law, and the King List memorializes that rhythm in sexagesimal. The pre-flood ages are the old verse, the post-flood ages the refrain. The tablet isn't bragging about immortal kings, it's telling you where to find the beat when the music stops and starts again. And if a culture could hide its calendar in the names of its rulers, then the rest of its memory might be stored the same way, embedded in architecture, ritual choreography, and star-facing walls. Which means when we read the numbers, we aren't just decoding a timeline, we're stepping into an operating manual disguised as history, waiting to be used the next time the river rises,